Hey friends, welcome back. If you're joining me tonight for the very first time, I'm so glad you found your way here. And if you've been here before, well, you already know what kind of night this is going to be. So go ahead, find your most comfortable spot. Pull that blanket a little closer, maybe dim the lights just a touch, because tonight we are going somewhere a little different. Not a faraway kingdom, not ancient battlefields. No. Tonight, we're going back to a world that was much closer than you might think. A world that existed in your grandparents' hands. Here is a thought that has been sitting with me lately. Think about your grandfather, or your grandmother, or maybe a great uncle you only met once or twice at a family reunion, standing by the grill wearing that flannel shirt that looked like it had survived 3 different decades. Now, what could that person do? I mean, really do? With their hands? My guess is quite a lot. They could fix a leaky pipe without calling anyone. They could hem a pair of trousers on a Sunday afternoon. They could bake a loaf of bread from memory. No recipe card, no YouTube tutorial, just the feel of the dough between their fingers. They could look at a broken engine and know, somehow, exactly where the problem was hiding. And here is the part that quietly knocks the air out of me when I think about it too long. That person, the one with all those hands-on built into their bone skills, was not a specialist. They were not a licensed professional. They were not extraordinary. They were just an ordinary person, living an ordinary life, in a world where knowing how to fix things, grow things, and make things was simply what it meant to be a capable adult. And then something happened. Something quiet and slow and so perfectly designed that most of us never even noticed it was happening. And that is exactly what tonight is about. If you're settling in and you are enjoying what you hear so far, I would love it if you took just a second to hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. Not because you feel you have to, but because when you genuinely enjoy something, sharing it keeps this little corner of the internet alive. And hey, I'm always curious. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you tucked into bed already? On a couch with a cat on your lap? Driving home on a quiet road? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one and it honestly makes my night. Now, keep the lights as soft as possible. If you have a fan nearby, let it run. Let the white noise wrap around you like something warm, and let us begin. It is the year 1955. The United States is riding a wave that feels almost too good to be true. The war is over. The factories that once built tanks and bombers are now churning out washing machines and station wagons. Families are pouring into brand new suburbs with brand new lawns and brand new mortgages they are actually proud of. And in a garage somewhere in Ohio, let us say it is a Saturday morning in early October, the kind of cool and golden morning that makes you feel like the whole world is in a good mood. A man named Robert is standing over the engine of his 1949 Ford. He is not a mechanic. He is an insurance adjuster, Monday through Friday. But on Saturday mornings he is something else entirely. He has his toolbox open. He has a repair manual sitting on the fender, its pages soft from being read so many times. He knows exactly what he is looking for, and he will fix it himself. Not because he has to, not because he cannot afford to pay someone, but because the idea of not being able to fix it simply never occurred to him. That was the world he grew up in, a world where the ability to repair, maintain, and build was not a hobby or a skill set. It was just part of being a person. Now let us travel forward about 70 years. The year is 2025. There is a survey making its way around the internet, and if you have not seen it, the numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. Researchers asked a large group of adults in the United States whether they could perform a set of basic household tasks. Things like replacing a light switch, patching a small hole in drywall, sewing a button back onto a shirt, sharpening a kitchen knife. The results were let us call them humbling. More than half of the respondents under 40 could not confidently complete any of those 4 tasks on their own. Not one. And the most common answer to why not was not, "I do not have time." It was not, "I never learned." It was something much more revealing. It was, "I would just buy a new one." Now, I want to be careful here, because this is not a story about blaming people. This is not a lecture. If you cannot fix a leaky faucet, that does not make you a bad person. Life is complicated, time is short, and there are a lot of things modern people can do that Robert from Ohio in 1955 absolutely could not. But there is something important worth understanding about how we got here, because it did not happen by accident. It was designed. In 1960, a journalist and social critic named Vance Packard published a book called The Waste Makers. It was a bestseller, and it was, to put it plainly, a bombshell. Packard had spent years watching American manufacturing quietly transform after World War II, and what he saw disturbed him. Companies were not just making products anymore. They were making products with the deliberate, calculated flaw built into them. A flaw called a death date. The idea was simple, and it was brilliant in the most cynical possible way. If you make a product that lasts 20 years, your customer buys it once and you never see them again. But if you make a product that lasts 3 years, or 2 years, or sometimes less, your customer keeps coming back, over and over, for the rest of their life. Packard gave this a name that became one of the most important phrases in the history of modern economics. He called it planned obsolescence, and by the time his book came out, it was already everywhere. Now here is where it gets interesting. Because planned obsolescence did not just change the products we bought, it changed the way we thought about fixing things. Think about it. If you buy a toaster and it breaks after 18 months, you have 2 choices. You can find someone to fix it, or you can spend $20 more and get a brand new one. Before the 1950s, most people chose to fix it, because that was the obvious choice. That was the sensible choice. That was the only choice that made sense in a world where things were built to last and repair was a natural part of life. But Vance Packard documented something chilling. By 1960, companies had already figured out that they could make products just difficult enough to repair and just cheap enough to replace, that fixing things started to feel like a fool's errand. And slowly, generation by generation, the people who knew how to fix things got older, and the children they raised did not always learn the same skills. Not because anyone told them not to, but because the culture had shifted quietly and completely from a world of repair to a world of replacement. Businessweek magazine published an issue in June of 1952. On the cover, they proclaimed that the 1950s was, in their own words, the age of do-it-yourself. And they were right in a way. The early part of that decade still had millions of Americans who tinkered, built, repaired, and made things with their hands. In 1951, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, yes, that Museum of Modern Art, held woodworking classes specifically for fathers and their sons ages 11 to 14. Not because woodworking was art, but because city families living in apartments were worried their boys were growing up without knowing how to use their hands. That concern, that quiet cultural worry that something was slipping away, was already present in 1951, and it was absolutely correct. Because here is what nobody tells you about the decades that followed. The same post-war prosperity that gave Robert from Ohio his new garage and his new tools and his shining new Ford also planted the seeds of something that would, over the next half-century, systematically dismantle the very skills that made Robert who he was. Suburbs needed maintenance, so companies sold maintenance contracts. Appliances broke down, so companies sold extended warranties. Clothing wore out, So companies opened more stores and told us that last season's jacket was already out of style, and with each of these steps one small skill quietly disappeared from the average household. Not with a bang, with a whisper, with a receipt. I want to tell you about something that happened in the late 1950s that I think perfectly captures this moment in history. Refrigerator manufacturers, particularly a brand called Kelvinator, began releasing their appliances in colours, new colours every year: Bermuda pink, spring green, turquoise blue. Beautiful, really. But here is the thing. The refrigerators themselves had not improved in any meaningful way. They did not keep food colder. They did not run more quietly. They did not use less energy. The only thing that had changed was the colour. But suddenly, if you still had last year's refrigerator sitting in your kitchen, the plain white one that worked perfectly, you were behind. You were old-fashioned. And the advertising of that era was absolutely masterful at making you feel it. The historian Elizabeth Cohen wrote that in the 1950s, the American consumer was actually praised as a patriotic citizen for buying more, not for being thrifty, not for making things last, for buying more. The good purchaser devoted to more, newer and better, she wrote, was the good citizen. So let us pause here for just a moment, because I think it is worth sitting with what that really means. In the span of a single generation, roughly from 1945 to 1975, the cultural identity of the average American quietly flipped, from someone who took pride in making things last, to someone who took pride in having the newest thing, from someone who fixed the old toaster, to someone who replaced it, from someone who grew their own vegetables, mended their own clothes and built their own bookshelves, to someone who ordered everything from a catalogue, called a repairman for anything that broke, and bought new clothes because the old ones were still perfectly fine but no longer in style. And the skills, the beautiful, patient, practical skills that had been passed down for generations. They did not vanish overnight. They faded, quietly. The way a language fades when there are no children left to learn it. I think about that a lot. The way a skill is like a language, in a way. You do not lose it the day someone decides not to teach it. You lose it the day the last person who knows it grows too old to pass it on. And we are living right now in that exact window of time. The grandparents who could fix anything are still alive, some of them, but they are in their 80s and 90s. And the window for learning from them, really learning, sitting beside them at the workbench and watching their hands, is closing. Faster than any of us would like to admit. But here is the thing that keeps this story from being just sad. There is a reason you clicked on this video tonight. There is a reason that YouTube channels about baking bread and repairing old radios and growing backyard gardens are quietly pulling in millions of views. There is a reason that the word homesteading, a word that would have sounded almost comically old-fashioned 15 years ago, is trending among people in their 20s and 30s. Something is waking up. Something is turning back toward the workbench. And I think that is one of the most beautiful things happening right now, quietly, beneath all the noise of modern life. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore 12 of the most profound skills that were once simply part of everyday life, and trace exactly when and why and how they slipped away. We're going to talk about kitchens and gardens, about needles and thread, about fire and the forgotten language of flame, about the art of writing a letter by hand, about navigating the world without a screen, and about what it might mean to bring some of these things back. Not because we have to, but because some part of us, some quiet, ancient, deeply human part of us, misses knowing how. So settle in, get comfortable, because our first stop is the kitchen, and the story of how, in the space of about 20 years, one of the most fundamental human skills, The ability to cook a meal from the raw materials of the earth was quietly handed over to a factory, and what we lost when we did, right? So we left off with Robert from Ohio and his garage, and the quiet, invisible machinery that began dismantling the skills of an entire generation. And now I want to take you somewhere even more intimate. I want to take you into the kitchen, because if there is one place where the loss of everyday skills plays out with the most tenderness, the most history, and honestly, the most surprising drama, it is right there, between the stove and the cutting board, in the place where, for most of human civilization, something extraordinary happened every single day. Let me start with a number that I find almost impossible to picture. In the year 1900, the average American woman spent 44 hours every single week on food preparation and cleanup. 44 hours. That is a full-time job. That is more time than most of us spend at our desks today. She was not watching cooking tutorials on her phone. She was not ordering ingredients from an app. She was doing what every woman before her had done, back through hundreds of years and across every continent on Earth. She was turning raw things, flour, lard, dried beans, a piece of salted pork, whatever the season and the budget allowed, into something that would keep her family alive and, if she was lucky, genuinely happy. And she knew how to do all of it, not from a recipe printed on the back of a box, from memory, from her mother's hands and her grandmother's hands, and the long, unbroken chain of women who had passed down that knowledge the way you pass down a name. Can you imagine that? I mean, really sit with it for a moment. Every loaf of bread in your house, made from scratch. Every broth, simmered for hours from bones you saved. Every jar of jam on the shelf, fruit you picked, sugar you measured, glass you sealed yourself. The kitchen was not just a place where food was made. It was a laboratory, a workshop, a living archive of knowledge that took years to master and a lifetime to perfect. And then, in the space of a single generation, something cracked. The first fault line appeared so quietly that almost nobody noticed. It was 1953, and a company called C.A. Swanson and Sons in Omaha, Nebraska, had a problem. A very large, very frozen problem. They had massively overestimated how many turkeys Americans planned to eat that Thanksgiving, and now they were sitting on 260 tons of frozen birds, 10 refrigerated railroad cars full of turkey, slowly crisscrossing the Midwest because the refrigeration units only worked while the train was moving, which, if you stop and picture it, is actually a little bit funny. A train full of turkeys just going in circles, desperately. Anyway, a Swanson salesman named Jerry Thomas had an idea. He had recently seen how airlines were serving pre-prepared meals to passengers in compartmentalized aluminum trays. What if you did the same thing at home? What if you put turkey, sweet potatoes, peas and cornbread stuffing into one of those trays, sealed it, froze it, and sold it to families for 98 cents? They ordered 5,000 trays to start just to test the idea. In the first full year of production, 1954, Swanson sold 10 million of them. 10 million. And by 1959, Americans were spending $500 million a year on frozen meals. The TV dinner had arrived, and something in the kitchen, something ancient and patient and deeply human, began to quietly step aside. Now I want to be clear about something, because I think it is too easy to tell this story with a kind of nostalgia that is not entirely fair. The TV dinner was not born out of laziness. It was born out of exhaustion, and out of a very real social shift that was happening at exactly the same time. In 1950, about 34% of American women were in the paid workforce. By the year 2000, that number had climbed to 60%. Millions of women were doing something radical and necessary and long overdue. They were stepping into careers, into offices, into the world beyond the home. And they were still expected in many households to have dinner on the table by 6. The frozen meal did not steal the kitchen from American families. It filled a gap that had opened up because the world was changing, and I think it is important to hold both of those truths at the same time. But here is where the story gets complicated in a way I find genuinely fascinating. Because the food industry, watching all of this happen, made a very deliberate choice about what to do next. And it was not just to make more convenient food. It was to make people feel that they needed convenient food. That cooking from scratch was not just time-consuming, it was old-fashioned. That a woman who could whip up a batch of biscuits from flour and lard was not skilled. She was behind. And the advertising of that era, particularly in the 1950s, was masterful at delivering this message. Manufacturers hired psychologists to understand exactly what would make a housewife reach for a box instead of a mixing bowl. There is a story about this that has become almost legendary in the world of marketing. When General Mills introduced their new Betty Crocker cake mixes in the early 1950s, they included everything: dried eggs, dried milk, all the ingredients, so that all you had to do was add water and stir. Simple, convenient, perfect, right? Except it did not sell. Women were not buying it. And General Mills was baffled, so they brought in a consumer psychologist named Ernest Dichter. Dichter was famous for conducting what we would now call focus groups, sitting down with ordinary housewives and asking them carefully and gently how they actually felt about these products. And what he found was this: the cake mix was too easy. Women felt guilty. They felt that if the box did everything, then they had not really made a cake. They had just opened a box and poured water. That was not cooking. That was barely even effort. And so General Mills made a counterintuitive decision. They removed the powdered eggs from the mix. They made it slightly less convenient. Now the box required you to crack open a fresh egg and add it yourself. 1 egg, that was all. And sales soared. Suddenly, women felt like they had participated, like the cake was something they had made, not just something they had reheated. It is one of the most quietly brilliant pieces of consumer psychology in the history of modern food. And it tells you something important, not just about marketing, but about what cooking meant to people. It meant something. It meant participation. It meant that you had put something of yourself into the food. The problem is what happened next, because that one small concession, that single egg, was in retrospect a kind of farewell. The last echo of the kitchen as a place of genuine skill and genuine making. Because from that moment on, the direction was clear. Faster, easier, less time, less effort, less knowledge required. And one by one, the skills that had been passed down through generations began to disappear from the average home. Not all at once, and not without resistance, but steadily like snow melting in early spring. By 1959, Americans were buying $500 million worth of frozen meals per year. By the mid-1970s, 3 forces arrived together that changed the kitchen more profoundly than anything since the invention of the stove. First, more women entered the workforce than ever before. Second, the microwave oven went from a laboratory novelty to a kitchen appliance. Sales tripled between 1972 and 1975. What once took an hour to cook could now be ready in 4 minutes. And third, fast food chains stopped being a regional curiosity and became a coast-to-coast institution. McDonald's, which had started as a single drive-in in San Bernardino, California in 1948, had 1,400 locations by 1970. By 1977, there were more fast food restaurants in the United States than there were public libraries. Let that sit for a second. more fast food restaurants than public libraries, and by the year 2000, half of all meals eaten by Americans were consumed outside the home. Half. In 1900, that number was essentially zero. Now, I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. When was the last time you made bread? Not from a mix, not in a bread machine. I mean really made it. Flour, yeast, water, salt, your own hands working the dough until it came alive. For me, personally, it was one of those experiences that surprised me completely. Because I expected it to be hard. I expected to fail at least twice. I expected it to take some mysterious skill that I had somehow missed out on. And it did take time, and my first loaf was honestly a little sad. Dense in all the wrong places, a bit pale on top, slightly gummy in the middle. But the smell of it baking was something I had no preparation for. That warm, yeasty, ancient smell that filled every corner of the room. And I thought, this is what kitchens used to smell like, every morning, in every house, before it all got handed over. Here is a detail from history that I keep coming back to. In the early 1900s, before labour-saving appliances changed everything, cooking a family meal was not typically a solo activity. In many households, it was a communal one. Daughters helped mothers. Grandmothers taught grandchildren. Neighbours shared techniques and recipes across back fences. There's a wonderful observation from a historian named Laura Shapiro, who spent years studying the transformation of the American kitchen. She wrote that the home kitchen of the early 20th century functioned as one of the primary spaces where family identity was built and maintained. It was where stories were told, where girls learned patience, where women negotiated their roles and their relationships and their sense of what mattered. And when the kitchen stopped being a place where skill was practiced, when it became just a place where things were reheated, something more than cooking disappeared with it, something harder to name, the rhythm of it, the conversation of it, the accumulated knowledge that passed between hands rather than through a screen. There is a statistic that I find both slightly funny and quietly heartbreaking at the same time. A survey published around 2019 found that 39% of millennials, nearly 4 in 10, said they wished they had learned how to cook in school, not calculus, not advanced chemistry, cooking. The thing their great-grandmothers could have taught them before breakfast. And what makes that number interesting is not just the wish itself, it is the word school, because it reveals something about how thoroughly the kitchen had stopped being a place of transmission. When you have to go to school to learn to cook, it means the home has already let go of that knowledge. It means the chain has already broken. But here is the twist. And this is the part of the story that gives me genuine hope. In 2020, when the entire world was suddenly locked inside its own walls, something unexpected happened in kitchens across the country. People started baking, not from boxes, from scratch. Sourdough bread in particular became almost a cultural phenomenon. Flour sold out in grocery stores across the country for weeks. People were keeping starters, little living jars of fermented flour and water that required daily feeding and tending like a small dependable pet. And social media, which is usually the great enemy of patience and slowness, became flooded with photographs of first loaves, lumpy loaves, gorgeous loaves, burned loaves, loaves that people were genuinely, absurdly proud of. And I think what that moment revealed was this: the desire had never actually left. It had just been buried under convenience and speed, and the steady accumulation of easier options. The longing to make something with your hands, to put raw ingredients together and coax something good out of them through effort and time and care, that is still there in almost everyone. Waiting quietly for a moment of permission, there is one more thing I want to leave you with before we move forward tonight. In 1965, researchers at a company called the United States Department of Agriculture measured how much time American women spent on food preparation each day. The average was just over 2 hours. By the late 1990s, that number had fallen to under 30 minutes. 2 hours to 30 minutes in one generation. Now, I am not saying 2 hours in the kitchen every day is the goal. I'm not even sure it was ever purely a joy for most women. 44 hours a week is exhausting, no matter how you feel about cooking. But somewhere in that sliding scale, somewhere between the grandmother who made everything from nothing and the grandchild who microwaves everything in 4 minutes, a huge amount of knowledge simply did not make the journey. Recipes that were never written down, techniques that lived only in hands, instincts about heat and salt and timing that take years to develop and 5 minutes to lose. And the beautiful, maddening, hopeful truth is that none of it is gone forever. It is just waiting to be remembered. Now cooking was only one room in the house that changed. There was another skill, one that goes back further than any kitchen, older than bread itself, woven into the very fabric of what it meant to clothe yourself and stay warm, that underwent a transformation just as dramatic and in some ways even more personal. Because this one was not about what you put in your body, it was about what you put on it, and the story of how we went from a world where every household could make and mend its own clothing, to a world where people throw away 68 garments a year without thinking twice, is one of the most quietly extraordinary shifts in the history of everyday life. That is where we are headed next. There is something I want you to picture before we go any further. It is the year 1900. Open the wardrobe of an average American woman, middle class let's say, living in a modest house in a town you've never heard of. Count what's hanging there. Go ahead. 7 garments, maybe 9 on a good year. That is it. 7 to 9 pieces of clothing total, not per season, not just her casual wear, everything. Her church dress, her work clothes, her one slightly nicer blouse she saves for company, her undergarments, her coat. Every single one of those pieces, either made by her own hands, altered from someone else's garment, or carefully chosen and budgeted for over months. And every single one of those pieces, when it tore or frayed or lost a button, was repaired. Not thrown away, repaired. Now fast forward to today. According to figures from the American Apparel and Footwear Association, the average American now buys approximately 68 garments and 7 pairs of shoes in a single year. 68. More than 1 piece of clothing per week, and more than half of those garments are disposed of within 12 months of purchase. Let me say that again, slowly. More than half, gone within a year. In 1 century we went from 7 garments, each one tended to like something precious, to 68, most of which we barely remember buying. How does something like that happen? The answer begins much further back than you might expect. Before we get to the malls and the synthetic fabrics and the factories in Bangladesh, we have to go all the way to a needle, a specific kind of needle, made of bone, or antler, or later, iron. Because for most of human history, and I mean most as in tens of thousands of years, the ability to sew was not a hobby. It was not a charming skill to learn on a rainy afternoon. It was survival. The Inuit people of the Arctic used needles carved from animal bone and thread made from caribou sinew to stitch together the layered garments that kept them alive in some of the most brutal cold on Earth. The stitching had to be airtight. Not because it looked nicer that way, because a loose seam in a -40 wind could mean a death. Across the American plains, indigenous peoples used sophisticated sewing techniques to assemble tipi shelters from dozens of tanned buffalo hides, structures that could be erected in under an hour and withstand prairie storms that would flatten a modern tent. For these communities, needlework was engineering, it was architecture, It was the difference between shelter and exposure, moving forward into the early 19th century in America and Europe. The picture does not change dramatically in terms of how much time and skill went into clothing a family. What changed was who did it, and under what conditions. In the early 1800s, a skilled tailor could sew about 30 stitches per minute by hand. A single man's shirt, just a shirt, took more than 12 hours to complete. A coat could take many days, which meant that for most families clothing was expensive, not just in money, but in time. And because it was expensive, it was cared for. Garments were mended and remended. Worn-out adult clothing was cut down and remade into children's clothing. Children's clothing was eventually repurposed into rags. Rags were sold to paper mills or used to make quilts. Nothing was wasted. Nothing. And embedded in that entire cycle of care and reuse was a skill set. Cutting, fitting, hemming, darning, patching. That every person in a household was expected to possess, at least at a basic level. It was as unremarkable as knowing how to sweep a floor. Then, in 1851, a man named Isaac Singer began selling a machine that would quietly begin dismantling all of it. Singer's sewing machine was not the first. A French tailor named Barthélemy Thimonier had built one as early as 1830. Several other inventors had tried and partially succeeded in the decades that followed. But Singer's machine was the one that actually made it into homes. And what made it different was not just the technology, it was the business model. Singer's original home machine sold for $125 in the 1850s, at a time when the average household income was around $500 a year. That is a quarter of your entire annual income for a sewing machine. So Singer did something revolutionary for that era. He offered an installment plan, $5 down, and you could take the machine home that day. It was one of the first consumer credit systems in American history, and it worked spectacularly. By the 1870s, American companies were producing more than 500,000 domestic sewing machines every year. By 1912, 60% of all sewing machines worldwide were made by Singer. The company had become one of the largest firms on the entire planet, not by making a luxury item, but by making a household necessity feel achievable. Now here is where it gets interesting, and a little complicated, because the sewing machine did not immediately make people stop sewing at home. If anything, it made them sew more, and faster. A shirt that once took 12 hours by hand could now be finished in about an hour. The 1850s saw sewing circles give way to something livelier. Women gathered not just to stitch together, but to share patterns, to talk about new designs from pattern companies like Butterick, which had just introduced the revolutionary idea of the standardized paper pattern in 1863. Before Butterick, if you wanted to copy a garment you'd seen in a fashion magazine, you had to carefully take it apart to figure out the cut. After Butterick, you could buy a paper template, lay it on your fabric and cut. Home sewing entered a kind of golden age, and that golden age remarkably lasted almost a century. Through the Depression era of the 1930s, when the government's message to struggling families was famously make, do and mend, sewing was not just a skill, it was a moral stance. A woman who could take a worn coat and turn it into something wearable was resourceful, admirable. She was doing something that mattered. Sewing manuals from that period have a tone that strikes me as almost fierce in its practicality. One guide from the 1930s advises readers to never throw away a garment until every possible use has been exhausted. Not just wearing it, not just mending it, but converting it. A dress becomes a blouse becomes a child's shirt becomes a dust cloth becomes stuffing for a pincushion. Nothing is wasted until there is absolutely nothing left to give. I find something almost beautiful in that philosophy, and something genuinely sad about how completely we have abandoned it. After World War II, and this is where things start to unravel, the golden age of home sewing ran straight into the beginning of its end. It did not look like an ending at first. The late 1940s and the 1950s actually saw a brief, genuine revival. Fashion designer Christian Dior had introduced his new look in 1947, with its cinched waists and full skirts, and women across America and Europe went wild for it. Fabric shops ran out of stock. Pattern companies could barely keep up with demand. Sewing contests were announced in newspapers with thousands of prizes. For a few years, it seemed like home sewing was more vibrant than ever. But beneath that surface, something was quietly shifting in the factories. The synthetic fabric revolution of the late 1950s and early 1960s changed everything. Polyester, nylon, acrylic. These materials could be produced cheaply, dyed in any colour, manufactured at industrial speed, and sold to consumers at prices that made buying a ready-made garment more economical than making one yourself. In 1960, the average American household spent more than 10% of its total income on clothing and shoes. The average person bought fewer than 25 garments per year, and about 95% of those garments were made in the United States, meaning that somewhere, in a factory, perhaps in North Carolina or Pennsylvania or New York's garment district, an American worker had cut and assembled them. Then came the trade liberalization policies of the 1970s and 1980s. Then came the offshoring. Factories began closing across the United States and reopening in countries where labor cost a fraction as much. By 2003, one major American retailer was sourcing its clothing from more than 1,200 factories in 42 countries, and the price of a shirt dropped so low that buying a new one became cheaper than buying the thread to repair the old one. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Cheaper to buy a new shirt than to mend the old one. Not because of any moral failure, just math. And so, one by one, the things that had been woven into the fabric of ordinary life, quite literally, began to disappear. Home economics classes, which had taught generations of American students basic sewing, mending and clothing repair, were quietly dropped from school curricula through the 1980s and 1990s. The sewing machine in the spare room got moved to the attic. The box of thread and needles got pushed to the back of a drawer, and skills that had been considered as basic as reading, skills that had been passed from grandmother to mother to daughter for thousands of years, simply stopped being passed on. Not because anyone decided they were worthless, but because the culture had made them feel unnecessary. Do you know what a darning mushroom is? I asked genuinely, because it's one of those objects that tells you everything about how a skill can vanish. A darning mushroom, or darning egg some called them, is a small, smooth, egg-shaped tool made of wood. You slip it inside a sock with a hole in it to stretch the fabric taut, and then you weave new thread across the hole in a careful, overlapping grid until the gap is filled and the sock is wearable again. It is one of the most elegant, simple, and satisfying repair tools ever made. And 50 years ago, you would have found one in almost every household in America. Today, most people under 40 have never seen one, and the socks, they go in the trash. Because socks cost $3 for a 5-pack, and darning a sock takes 20 minutes, and nobody taught you how, and the whole thing feels vaguely absurd when replacements are so cheap. But here is what gets lost in that calculation. The sock is not the point. The skill is the point. The capacity for patience is the point. The understanding that a thing can be fixed, that fixing it is worthwhile, that fixing it connects you to a long chain of people who fixed things before you. That is what gets lost when the sock goes in the trash. I think about my grandmother sometimes when I try to explain this to people. She grew up during the Depression, which meant she had no choice but to sew and mend and make things last. But she never stopped, even later when she could have easily afforded not to. She kept a small tin on her sewing table, a repurposed shortening can actually covered in faded floral paper, that held her needles and thimbles and spools of thread in about 40 different colours. I used to sit beside her and watch her work. Her hands moved with a speed and certainty that seemed almost impossible. Tiny, precise stitches appearing in exactly the right place, without her seeming to look. She was not performing a skill, she was being herself. And the garment she was mending, some button-up shirt of my grandfather's with a fraying collar, was going to last another 3 years because of those 20 quiet minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. I did not understand what I was watching at the time. I understand it now. Here is the number that brings this all into sharp focus. Today, Americans throw away approximately 17 million tons of clothing and textiles every year. 17 million tons. That is enough to fill the Mall of America, the largest shopping mall in the entire country, every 6 days. And most of those garments are made from synthetic fibres that will not break down in a landfill for hundreds of years, while somewhere in the ground, in older cemeteries, are the remains of women whose hands were never idle, who mended and made and repaired until the very end, and who would be genuinely baffled by the idea of throwing away a shirt because a button fell off. But here is what I keep coming back to. Here is the thing that keeps this from just being a sad story. The skill itself is not complicated. That is the strange and wonderful truth of it. Sewing on a button takes about 4 minutes. Hemming a pair of trousers that are an inch too long, maybe 30. Mending a small tear in a seam, 15 minutes, a needle, some matching thread, and a tiny bit of patience. These are not arcane arts. They are not beyond any of us. They were not beyond an 8-year-old girl in 1920 who learned them the way she learned everything else, by watching, and then by doing again until her hands knew what to do without asking her brain. The tools still exist. The knowledge still exists. It is just waiting for someone to pick it back up. There is a quiet movement happening, if you know where to look. Mending circles, groups of people who gather in cafes and community centres, each person working on their own pile of worn clothing, have been steadily growing in cities across the United States and Europe. Visible mending, a practice where people deliberately use colourful, contrasting thread to repair garments in ways that are meant to be seen rather than hidden, has developed its own community of dedicated practitioners. The idea behind it is almost radical in the current moment. The idea is that a garment repaired with care and skill is not a lesser version of itself. It is a better version. It carries its history in its fabric. It is proof that someone found it worth keeping. We have talked about the kitchen. We have talked about the wardrobe. But there is one skill that predates both of those rooms. One skill so old and so fundamental that it is woven into the very definition of what it means to be human, that has also quietly slipped out of our hands. It has nothing to do with food or clothing. It has to do with dirt and seeds, and the extraordinary relationship between a person and the patch of land beneath their feet, because before there were kitchens and before there were wardrobes, there were gardens. And the story of how we lost them, and what happened to our understanding of where food actually comes from when we did, is one of the most quietly profound shifts in this entire story. That is where we are headed next. Somewhere in the United States right now, there are 40 million acres of lawn. 40 million acres. That is roughly the size of the entire state of Wisconsin, blanketed edge to edge in grass that produces nothing edible, consumes enormous amounts of water, demands regular doses of chemical fertilizer, and requires someone to push a loud machine across it every single week from May through October. We call it the American Dream, and the story of how a nation that once fed itself from its own backyards ended up maintaining this vast, fragrant, extraordinarily expensive carpet of nutritional emptiness. Well, that is a story I've been thinking about for a long time. Because the shift from garden to lawn is not just a story about horticulture, it is a story about identity, about what we decided to value when we finally had enough money to choose, and about what we lost in the choosing. Let us go back to the very beginning of this particular loss. In 1900, 40% of the American workforce lived and worked on farms, not visited farms, not drove past farms on the way to somewhere else, lived on them, grew up waking before sunrise, doing things with their hands in the soil before breakfast, understanding in a deeply physical way exactly where food came from and what it took to coax it from the ground. 40%. Today, that number is less than 2%. Less than 2. In the space of a single century, the United States went from a nation where nearly half the population had a direct daily bodily relationship with the land that fed them, to a nation where most people have never planted a seed, have no idea what their region's growing season looks like, and genuinely cannot tell you whether a tomato plant needs full sun or shade. And I want to be careful here, because this is not a simple story with a simple villain. The mechanization of agriculture freed millions of people from backbreaking labor. It drove down the cost of food so dramatically that the average American household today spends only about 7% of its income on food, compared to 22% in 1950. That is a genuine, remarkable achievement. But somewhere in that achievement, something got misplaced. Something that cannot be measured in calories or dollars. The moment I keep returning to, the one that seems to crystallize the entire arc of this story, happened in the winter of 1941. A few weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, government officials in Washington were scrambling. The war had just begun. Shipping lanes were threatened. Commercial agriculture faced enormous new pressures. Not enough labor, not enough transportation, not enough steel for farm equipment, not enough tin for canned goods. Food security, which most Americans had taken entirely for granted, suddenly looked fragile. And so the government turned to its citizens with a request that, in retrospect, was one of the most extraordinary acts of collective mobilization in American history. They asked people to grow their own vegetables, not the farmers, everyone, apartment dwellers, office workers, school teachers, children. They called them victory gardens, and what happened next still astonishes me every time I look up the numbers. By 1943, there were more than 20 million victory gardens planted across the United States. 20 million. In a country whose total population at the time was around 132 million people. These gardens were in backyards, yes, but they were also in window boxes in apartment buildings, on rooftops in New York City and Chicago, in the median strips of streets in Boston, in the outfield of a baseball diamond in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. Vice President Henry Wallace planted one. Eleanor Roosevelt planted one right on the White House lawn, over the objections of the head groundskeeper, who apparently was deeply attached to his carefully maintained grass. And by 1944, those 20 million gardens were producing approximately 40% of all the fresh vegetables consumed in the United States. 40%. From backyard plots and window boxes, in a country where most of the gardeners had never grown anything more substantial than a houseplant before the war started. This is the detail that I find most moving about the Victory Garden story. Not the scale of it, not the patriotism behind it, but the speed. The government needed people to know how to garden essentially overnight. So pamphlets appeared, seed companies distributed packets. The Department of Agriculture printed guides showing even the smallest urban plot, 30 feet by 50 feet, laid out with rows of tomatoes and beans and carrots and onions in a configuration that would feed a family of 4 through the growing season. And people learned, quickly. Because as it turned out, the knowledge was not as far away as it seemed. Many people had a parent or grandparent who still gardened. Many communities had older neighbours who remembered. The skill had not been gone long enough to become truly foreign. It was still within reach. A 1944 poll found that 75% of American housewives were canning their own produce. Those women canned an average of 165 jars per year, each. Think about what that means. It means the American kitchen, even in the middle of a world war, was still a place where knowledge was being applied, where hands were doing skilled, methodical, meaningful work. Then the war ended. The soldiers came home. The factories that had been building bombs began building washing machines and automobiles and tract houses at a speed that seemed almost magical after years of scarcity. And the Victory Garden, which had seemed so essential, so patriotic, so obviously sensible just a few years before, quietly began to disappear, not all at once, but with a kind of inevitability that is almost poignant to look back on, because replacing the Victory Garden was something new, something beautiful in its way, something that perfectly captured the aspirations of a generation that had survived the Depression and the war and earned the right, they felt, to finally just rest and enjoy. The lawn. The story of Levittown, the sprawling suburb built on Long Island by developer William Levitt and his sons between 1947 and 1951, is often told as a story about housing, about the GI Bill and the dream of home ownership and the baby boom. And it is all of those things, but it is also a story about grass. Because when the Levitt Company built its 17,000 identical homes in that short, astonishing span of time, every single one of them came with a lawn already installed. Not a garden, a lawn. Flat, green, already growing, already requiring maintenance. And the company did not just provide the lawn, they enforced it. Written into the contracts of early Levittown homeowners was a requirement. Mow your lawn at least once a week during the growing season. Abraham Levitt himself wrote a regular gardening column in the local newsletter, advising residents on how to maintain their grass. He believed, and this is something worth sitting with, that a well-maintained lawn was not just aesthetic. It was, in his words, a form of neighborhood stabilization. The lawn as social glue, the lawn as a signal that you belonged, that you were keeping up, that you were contributing to the collective image of the community. Crabgrass, he wrote, was not just a horticultural problem, it was a social failure. The outdoor equivalent, as one historian later described it, of bad breath. And here is the thing about the lawn that I find genuinely fascinating. When the Levitt Company finished their first spring in 1948, the very first spring that Levittown had experienced as an inhabited community, Abraham Levitt did something that strikes me as almost tender in its paternalism. He sent crews out to fertilize and reseed every single lawn in the development, free of charge, and then he distributed pamphlets to all the new homeowners explaining exactly how to take care of their grass. He understood something that the gardening from scratch tradition had always required, but never needed to explain. That maintaining something beautiful requires knowledge. That knowledge has to be transferred from someone who has it to someone who does not. He just applied that principle to the wrong plant. What I want you to notice is the choice being made here. The suburban homeowner of the late 1940s and 1950s had a yard, often a sizable one. In many cases, more land than a family would have needed to grow a substantial portion of its own vegetables. That land was a genuine resource, It could have continued to be used the way victory gardeners had used it, as productive ground, as living food production, as a connection to the ancient, irreplaceable skill of growing things. Instead, it became grass. Useless, beautiful, conforming grass. A thing to be looked at and maintained rather than eaten. And with that choice, made not once but millions of times across millions of new suburban lots, the knowledge of gardening, which had briefly flared so brightly during the war, began to dim, not in one generation, but in 2 or 3. There is something else about those post-war chemicals that I think deserves a moment. The fertilizers and herbicides that swept into American suburbs during the 1950s and 1960s did not arrive from nowhere. A significant portion of the nitrogen-based technology that became the foundation of synthetic fertilizers had its roots in the chemistry developed for explosives during the war. The same industrial knowledge that had been directed toward destruction was, with remarkable speed, redirected toward fertilizing the lawns of a nation suddenly obsessed with grass. And some of the chemical compounds developed in wartime found peacetime applications in weed and pest control, which means that in a very literal, uncomfortable sense, the chemicals that killed crabgrass in Levittown in 1953 were cousins of the chemistry that had been unleashed on battlefields just a decade before. There is something about that transformation that I have never quite been able to shake. But the loss of the garden was not just a loss of food production, it was a loss of something harder to quantify. A survey done in 2019 found that 7% of Americans, 1 in every 14 people, genuinely believe that chocolate milk comes from brown cows. 7%. That is roughly 20 million people who believe that the colour of a cow determines the colour of its milk. Now, I tell that story not to embarrass anyone, because in a world where food comes pre-packaged, pre-processed, and utterly disconnected from its origins, it is not shocking that people lose touch with how it works. The shocking thing is how quickly it happened. We went from a country where 40% of the population lived on farms, and virtually everyone else had a parent or grandparent who did, to a country where a sizable portion of the adult population has no working mental model of how agriculture functions in 1 century. Let me ask you something, and I genuinely mean this as a question to sit with rather than a gotcha. Do you know what grows in your climate in October? Not everywhere, just where you live. What can you plant in the ground right now, in your particular corner of the world, and have something to eat from it before winter arrives? Kale, maybe. Spinach. Garlic bulbs that will wait patiently underground until spring. Radishes that will be ready in 3 weeks. Most people, and I include myself in this for much of my adult life, would have to look that up. In 1900, that knowledge would have been as basic as knowing your own address. The kind of thing you would have been embarrassed not to know. The kind of thing a child was expected to understand before they turned 10. I want to close this part of the story with one image from the Victory Garden era, because it is the image that has stayed with me the longest. There is a photograph from 1943. It shows a rooftop in New York City, and on that rooftop, in the middle of one of the most densely populated urban environments on the entire planet, a group of residents has planted a garden. Not a large garden, just raised beds and a few containers, crammed together in whatever soil they could carry up 6 flights of stairs. Tomatoes, beans, some herbs, and the people in the photograph are smiling. Not the polished smile of a magazine advertisement. The real smile of people who've done something that surprised them, who have grown something from nothing, who have discovered, maybe for the first time in their adult lives, that the ground, even a thin layer of it on a rooftop in Manhattan, will respond to care, that it is generous, that it remembers what to do, even when the people tending it have forgotten. The Victory Gardens faded after the war. The lawns came, the supermarkets came, the frozen vegetables and the year-round strawberries flown in from 5,000 miles away came, and the skill of growing things, the ancient, patient, deeply satisfying skill that our species had been practicing for 10,000 years, receded further and further from the centre of ordinary life. But here is what I notice, and what gives me genuine hope. Community gardens in American cities have been growing steadily for decades. The pandemic of 2020 triggered another wave of first-time gardeners, people who'd never grown anything and found themselves, quite suddenly, with time and a renewed desire to be connected to something real and slow and alive. Seed companies reported running out of stock in the spring of 2020 for the first time in memory. The same story as the Victory Gardens, almost 80 years later. Except this time, nobody told them to do it. This time, they chose it. That choice, the one being made quietly and in enormous numbers by people who are tired of being disconnected from how the world actually works, is going to come up again and again as we move through this story tonight. But first, we need to talk about something that predates gardens, something that predates cooking and sewing and every other skill we've explored so far. The very first technology our ancestors ever mastered, the skill that separates us from every other species on Earth, the one that, when you really sit with what it required, the patience, the judgment, the daily intimacy with something wild and alive and capable of destroying you, makes everything else we've talked about feel almost easy by comparison. Fire, not just making it, managing it, reading it, knowing it the way a grandmother knows the temperament of her own kitchen stove, but older. Much, much older. That is where we're going next. So, fire. I told you we were going there next, and I want to start not with a colonial kitchen or a campsite or a dramatic wilderness survival moment. I want to start with something much more ordinary. I want to start with a woman in 1847 Ohio, let us call her Margaret, standing at the hearth of her kitchen at 5 a.m. The house is cold. The children are still asleep upstairs, and Margaret is doing something that she does every single morning, something she has done without thinking for the better part of 20 years. She's reading the fire, not a book, the fire itself. She's looking at the ash bed left from the night before, at its colour, its depth, its warmth against her outstretched palm, and making a series of rapid, entirely unconscious calculations. Are the coals still live enough to catch fresh kindling without wasting precious tinder? How much wood will she need to bring the hearth to baking temperature by 7? Does the angle of last night's banked log tell her anything about how the draft has been behaving? Whether the flue is drawing well? Whether there is a change in the air? She does all of this before she has spoken a word to another person, before she has had anything to eat or drink, by touch and sight and smell and the particular weight of the iron poker in her hand. And not one single person in her household considers this remarkable. Because it isn't. It is just Tuesday. Here is something that genuinely astonishes me every time I turn it over in my mind. Human beings have been managing fire for approximately 1.5 million years. Let me say that again. 1.5 million years. The earliest known hearths, deliberately constructed fire pits built by our ancestors in Africa, have been dated to somewhere between 1.5 and 1.6 million years ago. The oldest confirmed evidence of deliberate fire-making tools in Europe was announced as recently as December 2025 by researchers at the British Museum, excavated from a site called Barnham in Suffolk, England. Their findings are human ancestors were deliberately and repeatedly making fire approximately 400,000 years ago, using iron pyrite struck against flint to create sparks. Not just using fire they found, making it. 400,000 years of making it. For most of that unimaginable span of time, every human being who survived to adulthood had a relationship with fire that was intimate, practical, and non-negotiable. You managed fire, or you were cold. You managed fire, or you were hungry. You managed fire, or the darkness and the animals that lived in it had access to you in ways you would rather not think about at 5 a.m. And then, in the space of roughly 100 years, a single heartbeat in the timeline of our species, most of us handed that relationship over entirely to a utility company. And most of us have never really noticed. I want to be honest about something before we go further. Fire management as a life skill has a complicated history. It was not, in the majority of cases, a comfortable or romanticized relationship. Open hearth cooking, the kind that Margaret was doing in 1847, was genuinely grueling work. Researchers who have studied the domestic history of colonial and early American households have documented what was sometimes called hearth death, a phenomenon where women, working close to open fires for hours each day, suffered fatal burns at rates that made it, up to the 17th century, the second leading cause of female mortality after childbirth. Their aprons and skirts caught sparks, their sleeves made contact with hot iron, their lungs lived with smoke. The hearth was a tool, but it was also a hazard, and the women who managed it daily were navigating that hazard with a level of skill and attention that we have largely forgotten to even acknowledge. So when I talk about the lost art of fire management, I am not suggesting we should all return to open hearths. I am saying something more specific than that. I am saying that the knowledge, the detailed, embodied, sensory knowledge of how fire behaves and what it needs, was something profound, something that shaped human cognition for millennia. Something worth understanding before we conclude that turning a knob on an electric range is a complete substitute. Let us talk about what that knowledge actually contained. Because it was not simple. A skilled hearth cook in colonial America, and this skill was held almost exclusively by women, passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, across generations, understood fire at a level of nuance that would be genuinely difficult to replicate with any modern interface. She knew how to bank a fire. Banking is the art of managing a fire at the end of the day so that it does not die entirely, but continues to hold heat through the night, requiring only a small intervention in the morning to bring it back to full life. You cover the remaining coals with a precise layer of ash, not too thick, not too thin. You need just enough insulation to hold the heat without smothering the ember. This is a judgment call. It is always a judgment call. There is no dial for it, no setting. The ash is your only tool, your hand is your thermometer, and the result, whether the coals are still live at 5 a.m. or stone cold, determines whether breakfast is ready at 6 or at 8. She also knew how to read wood. Different woods burn at different temperatures for different durations and produce different kinds of heat. This was not academic knowledge. It was practical and immediate and built over years of direct consequence. Apple wood and cherry wood burn hot and long with very little smoke. Pine burns fast and bright but leaves a resin build-up in the chimney that becomes a fire hazard over time. Hickory produces a sustained steady heat ideal for the long slow work of baking. Green wood, freshly cut, burns poorly and produces dangerous levels of creosote in the flue. You do not learn this from a book. You learn it from living with fire, from watching what happens when you use the wrong wood and the bread comes out raw in the center, from understanding over the course of seasons why certain logs belong at the back of the fire and others at the front, from developing a relationship with something that is alive in the most literal sense, consuming fuel, producing heat, requiring oxygen, generating byproduct, responding to every change in its environment with immediate and legible consequence. Have you ever watched a fire for a long time? Not in a fireplace at a holiday party where it was the backdrop. Watched it the way someone who depended on it would watch it. I mean, really looked at what it was doing. There is more information in a fire than most of us have ever been asked to read. The colonial kitchen hearth was not a single heat source. It was several, simultaneously. A large hearth in a skilled colonial kitchen might have 3 or 4 distinct fire zones operating at different intensities at the same moment. A large sustained log fire at the back for roasting. A smaller, brighter fire to one side for boiling. A bed of raked coals drawn forward for a low, steady braise. The bake oven to the side with its own separate fire that had been lit 2 hours earlier and now raked clean, its bricks holding the stored heat needed for bread. This is the equivalent of managing 4 separate burners at different settings simultaneously, except that none of them can be adjusted with a knob. Each one requires its own ongoing attention, its own maintenance, its own relationship. The woman doing this work was performing a continuous act of thermal intuition, sensing the heat from several feet away with her face and the backs of her hands, knowing when the roast needed turning from the sound of the dripping fat, knowing when the pot was about to boil over from the change in the steam, knowing when the bake oven had reached the temperature for bread. How did she know the oven temperature? She opened the door and slapped her hand briefly against the interior wall, on slap. If the heat bounced back from her palm immediately too hot, if her hand could linger for a count of 2 without discomfort, exactly right. If she could hold it there for 3, not hot enough yet. She knew from the feel of that single contact what a modern kitchen thermometer would measure in numbers. Her hand was the instrument. Her lifetime of accumulated practice was the calibration. And then there is the question of making fire from nothing, which is a different skill again. The ability to start a fire, not with matches, not with a lighter, but from materials found in the immediate environment, through skill and patience and physical technique, is one of the oldest and most demanding practical arts in human history. The bow drill method, a piece of softwood for the fireboard, a straight hardwood spindle, a simple bow to rotate it, a notch to collect the friction-generated dust, a nest of dry fibrous tinder to receive the first coal, require specific botanical knowledge, specific physical technique, and a level of patience that most modern people would find genuinely difficult to sustain. You're trying to create friction-generated heat of approximately 800 degrees Fahrenheit at the tip of the spindle. The notch in the fireboard collects the hot compressed wood dust. If the dust is the right temperature, the right consistency, and the right quantity, a small ember forms in it. You tip the ember into a prepared nest of dry grass and bark fibre. You cup the nest in your hands. You blow, very gently, very steadily. Too hard and you scatter the ember. Too soft and it dies. You're blowing a fragile coal into full flame with the control of a single human breath. The same control, the same patience, the same intimate relationship between person and fire that our ancestors practiced in every new campsite for 400,000 years. Most adults in the developed world today have never done this, and if the situation arose, if they were placed somewhere where warmth depended on what they could produce from materials at hand, they would not know where to begin. The transition away from the open hearth happened in stages, and more gradually than most people realize. The first stage was the wood-burning cook stove. Beginning around the 1830s, cast-iron cook stoves began to appear in American kitchens. Philo Stewart's Oberlin stove, introduced in 1834, was one of the most commercially successful early designs. A compact cast-iron stove that was significantly more fuel-efficient than an open fire, capable of sustained cooking temperatures with less physical labour. In its first 30 years, approximately 90,000 units were sold. By the 1850s, the cook stove was becoming the standard in American households. And here is the interesting thing about that transition. The women who made it were in many ways genuinely relieved. Not because the skill of fire management was unimportant to them, but because the open hearth was genuinely dangerous and exhausting. The cook stove was a real improvement, but it was also, quietly, the beginning of a long uncoupling, because the cook stove made fire somewhat more manageable, somewhat more predictable, somewhat less present as a direct sensory experience. The fire was now enclosed, contained behind iron, mediated by a box. You still needed to know how to bank it, how to read it, how to adjust the dampers and the drafts, and this still required considerable skill. But the directness of the relationship had decreased, and by the early 20th century, when coal stoves gave way to gas ranges and gas ranges gave way to electric ranges, the relationship had decreased further still, and then, in most ordinary households, it disappeared. The fire was gone. In its place, a coil of resistance wire under a glass ceramic surface, or the invisible burning of gas controlled by a precision valve, both of which work perfectly well, but neither of which you can read. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think there is something about fire specifically, something that makes it different from the other skills we've been discussing, that is worth sitting with. Research published in 2014 in the American Journal of Human Biology, conducted by Christopher Lynn at the University of Alabama, found something rather striking. Participants in the study who watched a fire, a real open fire, not a video of one, showed measurable decreases in blood pressure. The longer they watched, the more their blood pressure dropped. The effect was consistent across participants, and the more fully engaged they were with the fire, the more they were actually watching it rather than simply sitting near it, the stronger the effect. Lynn's hypothesis was that the hearth fire may have played a specific role in human social bonding across evolutionary time, that the regulated, predictable, safe fire around which early humans gathered may have actively calmed the nervous system in ways that facilitated the very behaviors that made us human: cooperation, storytelling, the sharing of knowledge across generations. The fire was not just cooking dinner. The fire was the original gathering space, the original social technology, and we have replaced it with the glow of screens, which are fascinating and endlessly stimulating, but which do not, as far as the research currently shows, lower anyone's blood pressure. I find that genuinely interesting, not as an argument against screens, but as a window into how much was happening in that circle of firelight that we did not have the vocabulary to name. And there is one more dimension to fire knowledge that I cannot leave out, because it operates at a scale far larger than the kitchen. In the summer of 2021, wildfires burned across more than 8 million acres in the western United States alone. Communities were destroyed, lives were lost, air quality in entire regions was rendered dangerous for weeks, and in the aftermath, fire scientists and indigenous land managers pointed, with considerable urgency, to a body of knowledge that had been practiced for thousands of years across much of North America and had been largely suppressed by the governments that displaced the people who held it. Controlled burning. Indigenous communities across the continent had, for millennia, managed their landscapes through carefully timed, deliberately set, intentionally constrained burns, burning the understory before it accumulated enough fuel to become catastrophic. Understanding which wind conditions allowed a controlled burn to proceed safely, and which conditions demanded waiting. Knowing which plants and ecosystems needed fire to regenerate and which needed protection from it. reading the land's fire ecology the way Margaret read the ashbed in her hearth at 5 in the morning. That knowledge was systematically outlawed. In 1850, the state of California passed a law prohibiting traditional native burning practices. Other states and territories followed. Indigenous practitioners were prosecuted. The knowledge was suppressed, and the fuel load accumulated decade by decade until the predictable consequences arrived in the form of the catastrophic fires of recent decades. In recent years, still too slowly, still at too small a scale, there has been a growing movement to restore this knowledge, to bring Indigenous fire practitioners back into partnership with federal land management agencies, to acknowledge, formally and practically, that 10,000 years of accumulated ecological fire knowledge represents something that no satellite imaging system or fire suppression doctrine can fully replace. Fire knowledge, it turns out, is not just practical at the scale of the kitchen. At the scale of the landscape, it is a matter of survival, for communities, for forests, for the water systems that forests sustain, for everyone downstream, which is to say, for essentially everyone. We've been moving through this story in a particular order, from cooking to sewing to growing, and now to fire, from the most recent losses to the oldest. And the pattern that keeps emerging, the thing I find myself turning over the more we explore, is that each of these skills required a relationship with the material world that was intimate, sensory, ongoing, and responsive. A relationship in which you were not a consumer of a product. You were a participant in a process, and the process changed you. Working with fire for long enough changes the way you notice warmth and cold, the way you read a room when you walk into it, the way you understand risk and attention, and the invisible physics that hold the world together. Those changes are not small. They are what it meant for most of human history to be fully capable of being alive. But there is something I want to say before we move on, because all the skills we've explored tonight, the cooking, the sewing, the growing, and now the fire, all of these were the inputs, the things that kept people fed and warm and clothed. But there was another set of skills, a different kind, the skills of the built world itself, the repair and maintenance of the physical structure that made everything else possible, the plumbing, the wiring, the roof, the walls, the house, and the story of how those skills were lost, and the extraordinary, deliberate, calculated way in which that loss was engineered, is one of the most remarkable stories I've come across in all of this research. It starts with a light bulb, a very specific light bulb, in a fire station in Livermore, California. That has been burning since 1901 and is still burning right now as you listen to this, which means it is time to talk about what the people who made that bulb knew and what was done very carefully by very powerful men in a room in Geneva in December of 1924 to make sure that you would never benefit from that knowledge again. That is where we are going next. There is a fire station in Livermore, California that I want to tell you about. It is an ordinary-looking place. Suburban street, modest building, the familiar smell of diesel and floor cleaner that all fire stations seem to share. But if you walk inside and look up toward the ceiling of the engine bay, you will see something extraordinary. Hanging there, unremarkable in its size but astonishing in its existence, is a light bulb. Just a light bulb. Hand-blown glass, carbon filament, 4 watts of soft, steady glow. The bulb was manufactured by the Shelby Electric Company of Shelby, Ohio, sometime in the late 1890s. It was installed in the Livermore firehouse in 1901, and it has been burning almost continuously ever since. As of right now, 125 years later, it is still on. The Guinness Book of World Records certified it as the longest burning light bulb on the planet, When it was moved to a new fire station in 1976, the bulb received a full fire truck escort through the streets of Livermore, and an electrician was standing by at the new location to ensure the transfer took no more than 22 minutes. People came from across the country to watch. 22 minutes of darkness and then light again, for a bulb that had already been burning for 75 years. Now I want you to hold that image in your mind for a moment. A light bulb that has burned for over a century. And then I want to tell you about a secret meeting. It happened on December 23rd, 1924. Christmas Eve was the next day. While most of Geneva, Switzerland, was wrapped up in holiday preparations, the representatives of the world's largest light bulb manufacturers were gathered around a conference table. Present were Germany's Osram, the Netherlands' Philips, France's Compagnie des Lampes, Associated Electrical Industries from Britain, and the European subsidiaries of General Electric from the United States. Together, they formed a body called the Phoebus Cartel, named with a certain dark irony after Phoebus Apollo, the Greek god of light. And what they agreed to do in that room was one of the most quietly consequential decisions in the history of consumer culture. They agreed to make their light bulbs worse, deliberately, carefully, on purpose. Here is the technical context that makes this remarkable. In 1924, a standard household light bulb typically lasted between 1,500 and 2,500 hours. Some lasted longer. The Livermore bulb, handmade with a thick carbon filament and exceptional quality control, was already burning toward what would become a 20-plus year streak without replacement. Quality, in other words, was entirely achievable. The engineering knowledge existed. The materials existed. The cartel's own engineers knew exactly how to make a bulb that lasted. And so what the Phoebus cartel directed those same engineers to do was the opposite. They needed them to calculate, with precision, how to make a bulb that would reliably fail after exactly 1,000 hours. Not because 1,000 hours was the natural limit of the technology, but because 1,000 hours meant customers came back to buy more bulbs. 2,500 hours meant they didn't have to. The engineers worked on this problem for years. They adjusted current. They manipulated voltage. They modified the tungsten filament in ways that would cause it to weaken and fail at the agreed-upon moment. Each factory sent regular samples to the cartel's central testing laboratory in Switzerland for verification. If your bulbs were lasting too long, you were fined. And by 1933, the average lifespan of a household bulb had been engineered down from 1,800 hours to 1,200. Not by accident, not by budget cuts, by design. Most people have never heard of the Phoebus cartel, which is itself extraordinary given what it represents. This was the first genuinely global cartel in history. The first coordinated effort by international corporations to manage not just prices and markets, but the actual physical quality of the things they sold. It was the prototype, the proof of concept, the moment when planned obsolescence went from an abstract economic theory to a practical business strategy executed by engineers with slide rules and testing schedules. And here is what I find most remarkable about it. The bulb in Livermore was still burning, made before any of this, made by hand, with care, by people who were not yet thinking about shortening its life, and it has outlasted every subsequent generation of its replacements by a factor of more than 100. The things we used to make when we tried to make them lasted. The story of home repair in America runs almost exactly parallel to this arc, and it is, I think, one of the most human stories in the entire history of everyday life. Because it is not just a story about tools and skills, it is a story about what it meant to be capable, about what it meant to look at something broken and believe, with quiet certainty, that you could fix it, Cast your mind back to the years just after World War II ended. The American suburb was still being invented. Millions of veterans were coming home, most of them having spent years doing things with their hands that they had never done before, maintaining machinery, repairing equipment in the field, learning the body language of tools under pressure. And those same men were now, with the help of the GI Bill, buying homes for the first time. Not just any homes, homes they owned. In 1890, only 37% of American dwellings were owner-occupied. By 1960, that number had climbed to more than 60%. 30 million families owning homes. 30 million families with roofs that leaked, and pipes that froze, and wiring that sparked, and wooden floors that groaned. And overwhelmingly, those families fixed those things themselves. Businessweek magazine, in a June 1952 issue that I keep coming back to, declared the 1950s the age of do-it-yourself. And they were not wrong. The DIY movement of the post-war decade was enormous, not just in economic terms, though the home improvement industry was already a $12 billion business by 1960, but in cultural terms. In the 1950s, the garage workshop became a kind of masculine sanctuary. Advice manuals of the era actually encouraged men to claim a room in the house for their tools. The attic, perhaps, the basement, the garage, ideally. A space that was theirs, understood as a masculine enclave in a domestic sphere otherwise managed by women, and into that space went toolboxes, workbenches, power drills, lumber, paint, sealant, sandpaper, the accumulated hardware of a man who was ready for whatever the house threw at him. Historian Stephen Gelber, who wrote what remains the definitive academic study of this period, described the DIY movement as domestic masculinity, the way that working with tools allowed men who spent their days behind desks to reconnect with the sense of physical competence that office life had taken away from them. The writer Charles Lummis captured the ethos precisely when he wrote, in a phrase that was frequently quoted at the time, "Any fool can write a book, but it takes a man to dovetail a door." There is something almost tender in that sentiment, once you understand the context. These were men who felt the industrialized world had made them spectators, who needed the workbench to feel real. But here is where the story takes its quietly devastating turn, because the same forces that created the planned obsolescence of light bulbs in 1924 were, by the 1950s and 1960s, being applied to everything in the American home. Washing machines began to fail after a few years rather than a few decades. Television sets burned out. Refrigerators with perfectly functional mechanisms were replaced not because they stopped working, but because the new models came in spring green and Bermuda pink and made last year's plain white appliance look embarrassingly dated. And the things that did break, increasingly, they were designed in ways that made repair not just difficult but practically impossible for the average homeowner. Parts were being made proprietary. Designs were becoming more complex than they needed to be, not because complexity improved function, but because it discouraged independent repair. Vance Packard, in his 1960 book, documented how some companies had created what he called a system of double dipping, selling products they knew would fail and then profiting a second time from the repairs. By 1960, the United States had twice as many professional repairmen as it did before the war, 2 million people whose entire livelihood depended on the steady stream of things that Americans could no longer fix themselves and could no longer expect to last. The dependence was being manufactured, literally. Do you know what a right to repair law is? Because if you have heard of it only recently, I want you to understand that the fight behind it is not new. The battle to preserve a person's legal right to repair the things they own has been running, in various forms, for the better part of a century. It just keeps getting harder to win. In December 2024, the state of Massachusetts passed the first right to repair law in the United States for the automotive sector, requiring manufacturers to provide independent mechanics with the same diagnostic tools and service information they gave to their own dealerships. That battle to access the data needed to fix your own car had been ongoing for more than a decade. And the automotive fight was, if anything, the simpler version of the problem, because by the time consumer electronics entered the picture, the strategies for preventing repair had become extraordinarily sophisticated. Consider the most recognizable product in the world, the iPhone. In 2001, when Apple released its first iPod, it came with a battery that could not be replaced. The entire device was sealed, and when the battery died, as lithium-ion batteries inevitably do, you could not buy a new battery and install it. You had to buy a new iPod. The cost of a replacement battery from Apple at the time was $49 plus shipping. The retail price of the iPod itself was also $49. If you wanted your old device repaired, it cost more than buying a new one, which was, of course, precisely the point. This strategy migrated from the iPod to the iPhone. Phones began arriving with screens glued rather than screwed, batteries sealed in with adhesive, components electronically paired to specific circuit boards, so that even if you sourced the correct replacement part, installing it would trigger software warnings telling you the repair was unauthorized. In 2015, thousands of iPhone users discovered that a software update, iOS 9, had disabled phones that had been serviced by independent repair shops. An error message appeared, Error 53. The phone was, to all intents and purposes, bricked, because someone outside Apple's approved network had touched it. Kyle Wiens, the co-founder of iFixit, the global repair community that has been fighting this battle for over 2 decades, described Apple's approach simply. They had gone out of their way, systematically over many years, to prevent people from fixing their own devices. Apple actively opposed right-to-repair legislation for 22 years. 22 years. Before finally, under enormous pressure from lawmakers, regulators, and a public that was starting to understand what was actually happening, endorsing it in September 2023. There is a pattern here that I think is worth naming directly. In 1924, the Phoebus cartel decided, in a hotel room in Geneva on the day before Christmas, to make the things people bought deliberately worse than they could have been. In 1960, Vance Packard named and documented this pattern for the American public. In 2023, after almost a century of the same strategy being applied to ever more sophisticated products, Apple was still fighting to prevent ordinary people from opening the devices in their own pockets. The strategy has not changed, only the products have, and what has been lost along the way is not just money, though the cost is real. A 2021 survey found that more than 80% of Americans supported right-to-repair legislation. 80%. Which tells you how widely people feel the frustration of owning something they are not allowed to fix. But the deeper loss is harder to measure. It is the loss of the man in the garage on a Saturday morning who knew his house the way he knew his own hands. The loss of the quiet dignity that comes from looking at something broken and knowing, without doubt, that you can make it whole again. The loss of the relationship between a person and their possessions, a relationship that requires knowing how the thing works, understanding its parts, being willing to get your hands dirty in its service. That relationship was never just practical, it was personal. It was, in a way that is hard to articulate but easy to feel when it is gone, a kind of freedom. There is a small, quiet corner of the internet that I find genuinely moving. It is the iFixit community. More than 1 million people worldwide who have written and shared over 22,000 free repair manuals for more than 6,000 devices. People teaching other people how to fix things for free in their own time, because they believe, with a conviction that feels almost old-fashioned in the best possible way, that if you own something, you should be able to understand it, and if it breaks, you should be able to fix it. There is also a growing movement of repair cafes, community spaces, usually in church halls or community centres, where volunteers with technical skills sit alongside people who have brought in broken appliances, torn clothing, or malfunctioning electronics, and work together to find a fix. The first repair cafe opened in Amsterdam in 2009. By 2023, there were more than 3,000 of them worldwide, 3,000 places where people gather, not to buy things, but to fix them, to remember how. I think about that Livermore light bulb sometimes, late at night, still burning, still doing exactly what it was made to do. In a building where real emergencies are handled by people who are trained to remain calm when everything is breaking down. It seems almost perfect as an image, doesn't it? A thing made with genuine care, built to last, quietly outlasting every planned replacement. A small, stubborn argument, burning at 4 watts, against the entire philosophy of disposability. We have talked about the things people made with their hands, clothes they sewed and mended, bread they baked from scratch, engines they tuned on Saturday mornings, gardens they grew from seed. But there is one skill that runs beneath all of these, one that kept the food from spoiling before the refrigerator arrived, that stretched the harvest through the winter, that allowed a family in rural Vermont or rural France to eat well in February from jars they had filled in August. It is one of the oldest forms of chemistry our species ever practiced, and it is making a remarkable, fermenting, quietly revolutionary comeback. That is where we are headed next. What I'm about to tell you begins with a ship, specifically the H.M. Bark Endeavour. The year 1768. Captain James Cook is preparing to leave England for the South Pacific on what will become one of the most remarkable voyages of exploration in human history. His crew will map the eastern coastline of Australia. They will make first contact with dozens of indigenous peoples. They will observe the transit of Venus across the sun from the island of Tahiti. But before any of that could happen, Cook had to solve a problem that had been quietly destroying the European navies for 2 centuries. Scurvy. Between 1500 and 1800, scurvy, caused by severe vitamin C deficiency during long ocean voyages, killed an estimated 2 million sailors. 2 million. More than all the naval battles, shipwrecks and storms of the same period combined. Whole crews would come down with it. Gums turning black, teeth falling out, joints swelling to grotesque sizes, old wounds reopening as though the body was trying to unmake itself from the inside out. One naval chaplain who survived an early voyage described sufferers with skin as black as ink, and breath so foul it could be detected from across the deck. It was, in the language of the day, the plague of the sea and the spoil of mariners. And Captain Cook, before he set a single sail, loaded his ship with the cure. 7,860 pounds of it. The cure was sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, the same humble, salt-preserved, bacteria-transformed vegetable that workers had been eating at the construction of the Great Wall of China over 2,000 years earlier. The same thing that Genghis Khan's armies had packed in barrels and carried across their campaigns through Central Asia. The same thing that Roman soldiers had known as a remedy for intestinal complaints on long marches. Something so old and so ordinary that most of the crew of the Endeavour initially refused to eat it. Cook's solution to the crew's reluctance was characteristically practical. He reserved the sauerkraut for the officers' table only, conspicuously, in full view of the enlisted men. Within weeks, every sailor on the ship was clamoring for it. Because if the officers were eating it, it must be something worth having. Classic human psychology, deployed in the name of colonial exploration. 3 years later, Cook returned to England without a single death attributed to scurvy. Without knowing the chemistry behind it, without knowing anything about vitamin C, which would not be identified scientifically for another century and a half. The crews of Cook's voyages had been saved by the accumulated practical wisdom of people who had been fermenting food for thousands of years before anyone could explain why it worked. That gap between knowing something works and understanding why it works is, I think, one of the most interesting aspects of the history of food preservation. Because for most of human history, people were extraordinarily skilled at a science they did not have a name for. They knew that salting meat made it last through winter. They knew that packing shredded cabbage tightly in its own juice, weighted down with a stone, would transform it into something sour and stable that could be eaten months later. They knew that milk, left in certain conditions, would become cheese or yogurt instead of simply rotting. They knew that grapes, crushed and left in the right vessel at the right temperature, would become wine. None of them could have told you about lactobacillus bacteria. None of them knew that they were creating an acidic environment hostile to harmful microorganisms. They just knew it worked. They had learned it from the person before them, who had learned it from the person before them, in an unbroken line of practical knowledge stretching back, in some cases, 8 or 10,000 years. It was not until 1864, and you will notice this pattern of understanding arriving decades after the practice, that a French microbiologist named Louis Pasteur finally demonstrated scientifically the relationship between microorganisms and food spoilage. Pasteur did not invent fermentation, he explained it. He gave the scientific community the language to understand what human beings had been doing intuitively since before the invention of writing. And the irony that I find quietly astonishing is this. Nicolas Appert, the French confectioner who had invented modern canning in the late 1700s, winning 12,000 francs from Napoleon Bonaparte for solving the problem of how to feed an army on the march, had done so without any understanding of why his method worked. He placed food in glass jars, sealed them, and boiled them in water. The food stayed preserved. He believed it was the exclusion of air that did the trick. He was wrong about the mechanism, but the jars worked perfectly. 50 years of human beings successfully canning food, having solved the problem through patient experimentation rather than through scientific theory. The science caught up to the practice later. It almost always did. Let me tell you about John Landis Mason, a 26-year-old New Jersey tinsmith who, in November of 1858, filed a patent for what he called an improvement in screw-neck bottles. It was a glass jar with a threaded neck, a zinc lid with a rubber gasket that created an airtight seal when screwed on. Elegant, simple, virtually indestructible in concept if not always in execution. The Mason jar. And the Mason jar transformed America, not dramatically, not in a way that made front pages or changed political maps, but quietly, profoundly, at the level of the kitchen shelf, at the level of the cellar and the pantry and the root cellar. The Mason jar changed how ordinary American families survived the winter. By the 1880s, the Ball Brothers Glass Manufacturing Company of Buffalo, New York, had begun producing Mason's design at enormous scale, and canning became as ordinary and expected a part of the late summer household as harvest itself. Summer kitchens, separate outbuildings attached to farmhouses, became an architectural feature specifically designed to accommodate the heat and steam of the canning season. Weeks of boiling, sealing, labelling, dozens of women in an ordinary neighbourhood spending their late August and early September in a rhythm as reliable as the seasons themselves. Peaches in July, tomatoes in August, green beans, corn, beets, plums, apple butter simmering low on the stove all morning, thickening into something that would taste like October even in the grey middle of February. The first dedicated canning cookbook, written by a food pioneer named Sarah Tyson Rohrer in 1887, appeared the same year the Brooklyn Bridge opened. Two very different kinds of human achievement. But in terms of the daily lives of ordinary American families, I would argue that Rohrer's canning guide was the more consequential document. Does anyone in your family still can? I asked genuinely, because for me the answer was yes, barely. One grandmother who made jam every summer, somewhat grudgingly, in a kitchen that smelled of hot sugar and rubber seals. The other grandmother who had long since switched to the freezer, which she treated as a kind of technological miracle and referred to regularly as the most wonderful invention. And in their two attitudes toward the same problem, preserving the harvest, I can see the exact moment when a 10,000-year tradition began to give way. The freezer won. Not because frozen food was better, in most respects, it was not. Properly canned tomatoes beat frozen ones on flavour. Properly fermented pickles beat vinegar-brined store-bought pickles on nutrition, on complexity, on everything except convenience. But the freezer was faster. It required less knowledge, less vigilance, less time standing over a hot stove in August verifying that the seals had popped correctly. And in the economy of the mid-20th century, where women were increasingly working outside the home, where time was suddenly the scarcest resource in the household, faster and easier won almost every argument. In 1944, at the height of the Second World War, a survey found that 75% of American housewives were doing home canning. Those women put up an average of 165 jars per year. Each. The total across the country in that single year came to 3.5 billion quarts of home-preserved food. 3.5 billion. That number staggers me every time I look at it. An entire country feeding itself from skills that most of those women had learned from their mothers, who had learned from their mothers, stretching back through time to a world before grocery stores and refrigerators and anything that came in a package. And then the war ended. The factories reopened. The supermarkets arrived. The frozen food aisle appeared. And within one generation, most of those 3.5 billion jars would become something only grandmothers did, and only barely. The loss of fermentation as a household skill is, I think, slightly different from the loss of canning. Because fermentation is not just food preservation. It is, quite literally, the oldest biotechnology our species ever practiced. Long before we had words for bacteria or yeast or lactobacilli. Long before anyone understood acidity or probiotics or the microbiome, human communities across every continent had discovered that certain transformations, cabbage into sauerkraut, milk into cheese, grain into bread, soybeans into miso, rice and water into sake, barley and hops into beer, made food not just last longer but become something different, something more complex, something, in most cases, more nutritious than what you started with. Ancient Greek physicians recommended fermented foods for digestion. Roman soldiers carried fermented cabbage in their packs, precisely because experience had taught them it kept their guts stable over long campaigns. Workers building the Great Wall of China were fed fermented cabbage through the harsh winters as a matter of survival economics. It was cheaper than meat, more nutritious than plain grain, and it lasted. The Icelandic people developed hakal, fermented Greenlandic shark, buried in the ground under stones for weeks to draw out the toxins, then hung to dry for months. Not because it sounded appealing, but because in an environment with almost no alternatives, fermentation made the inedible edible. That is the kind of knowledge we're talking about, not a hobby, not a culinary trend. The knowledge of how to negotiate with the invisible ancient world of microorganisms to produce food that keeps you alive when nothing else will. Here is what I find most remarkable about the contemporary moment. Louis Pasteur identified the relationship between microbes and human health in the 1860s. By the mid-20th century, the industrial food system had largely accepted a philosophy that could be summed up as kill all the microbes, pasteurize everything, sterilize everything. The goal was a food supply that was predictably uniform, that never surprised you, that came from a factory and arrived in the same state every single time. Fermentation, which is by nature unpredictable and alive and different every time you make it, did not fit into that model. And so a skill that had kept human beings alive and well for 8,000 years was quietly reclassified from necessity to nostalgia, to the province of enthusiasts and eccentrics who kept crocks of mysterious bubbling things on their kitchen counters and talked about probiotics at dinner parties. And then, in 2020, something happened. The world locked down, and millions of people, suddenly home, suddenly with time, suddenly anxious about the future of the food supply, reached for old knowledge. Sourdough bread, leavened by the same wild fermentation process that Egyptian bakers had been using for at least 6,000 years, became a cultural phenomenon. But sourdough was just the most visible part of a larger wave. Kombucha. Kimchi made at home, not bought in a jar. Miso fermented in crocks on apartment balconies. Homemade kefir. Pickles brined in salt water rather than vinegar, because someone had read that the old way preserved the living bacteria. Mason jars, which had been experiencing a gentle revival as decorative objects for barn weddings and rustic kitchen aesthetics, suddenly sold out at hardware stores across the country. Not for flowers, for actual food. The science caught up too. Research into the human microbiome, the community of bacteria, fungi and other organisms that live in and on the human body, has exploded in the last 2 decades. And one consistent finding has emerged from that research across hundreds of studies from institutions on multiple continents. Fermented foods, the bacteria in well-made sauerkraut, the live cultures in traditionally fermented yogurt, the wild yeasts in real sourdough bread. These are not just food, they are medicine in the oldest possible sense, the sense of something that the human body has co-evolved with over thousands of years, that contributes to the health of systems we're only now beginning to understand. The gut-brain connection, the immune system, the regulation of inflammation. Your great-grandmother did not know any of this in scientific terms, but she put up 165 jars a year anyway, and I suspect her gut thanked her for it. What moves me most about this particular skill is not the science, it is the philosophy. The philosophy that the things your grandmother made in her kitchen, the things that smelled strange and took weeks and required a certain kind of patience that modern life does not encourage, those things were not primitive. They were not unsophisticated. They were the accumulated practical intelligence of 10,000 years of human beings paying close attention to what kept their families alive and healthy. We did not abandon fermentation because we found something better. We abandoned it because we found something faster. And those two things are not the same. We have moved through so many of the skills that shape the texture of everyday life. What people ate, what they wore, what they built with their hands, how they preserved the abundance of one season to sustain themselves through another. But there is a skill we have not yet talked about that is in some ways the most personal of all, one that does not have to do with food or clothes or shelter, one that has to do with the way we communicated, the way we put language onto a surface and sent it across the world in an envelope. The way a person's own hand, the specific, irreplaceable, unmistakable movement of their pen on a page, could carry their voice, their mood, their personality into the hands of someone they loved who was far away. The lost art of the handwritten letter, and what disappeared with it when we let it go. That is where we are headed next. Somewhere in a cardboard box in an attic in Ohio or Virginia or Kentucky, or any of 1,000 other places where families have stored the things they could not bring themselves to throw away, there is almost certainly a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Some of them may be over 150 years old. Some may be from a great-great-grandfather who went to war in 1861 and wrote home every week he could, in careful, looping cursive, on whatever paper the army could provide. Others might be love letters, or letters from a mother to a son who moved away, or a daughter's letters home from her first year of college, full of homesickness and excitement in equal measure. And if you're lucky enough to find one of those bundles, and if you can read the handwriting, and that second condition is increasingly not guaranteed, you will discover something that consistently takes people by surprise. These letters are good, not just emotionally moving, though they are that. Genuinely good as writing, precise, vivid, personal. The kind of prose that reveals not just events but personality. The kind of words that carry, across a century and a half of silence, the unmistakable voice of an actual human being. During the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865, historian Christopher Hager has estimated that something close to 500 million letters passed between the roughly 3 million soldiers who served and the families they left behind. 500 million. One army chaplain, whose regiment's mail he carefully documented, sent out 3,855 letters in a single month. A single Union soldier named Sullivan Ballou, writing to his wife just 1 week before the first Battle of Bull Run, produced a letter so extraordinary in its tenderness and literary precision that it has been read aloud at memorial ceremonies, set to music, and broadcast on national television more than a century after his death. And Ballou was not a writer by trade. He was a lawyer from Rhode Island. He was 28 years old. He had not gone to a writing program or studied literature at university. He'd simply grown up in a world where writing a letter was something you did, and you did it with care, and you practiced until your words were worth reading. What made that world possible was a skill that most people today associate with grade school drills and ink-stained fingers, and an era that feels impossibly distant. Penmanship, the deliberate, disciplined, often beautiful practice of forming letters on a page. For most of American history, this was not considered a nice-to-have. It was considered as fundamental to literacy as reading itself. In the 1800s, a person who could not write a clear, legible hand was functionally impaired in the world of commerce, correspondence, and civic life. And so the teaching of handwriting, its proper method, its proper tools, its proper posture, was taken very seriously indeed. The first system to dominate American schoolrooms was developed by a man named Platt Rogers Spencer, a self-taught penman from Ohio who, sometime in the 1840s, sat down and formalized a style of writing that drew its inspiration, he claimed, from the flowing curves of nature, the oval forms of leaves and pebbles, the fluid lines of the Ohio River bending through countryside. Spencerian penmanship, as it came to be called, was elegant almost to the point of the ornate, an art form as much as a communication tool. If you have ever seen the original Coca-Cola logo, with its curling, confident script, you have seen Spencerian penmanship at work. It dominated American schools from the 1850s through the 1880s, and then along came Austin Norman Palmer. Palmer was a man of deeply practical convictions. He looked at Spencerian penmanship and saw something dangerously inefficient for a nation in a hurry. Too ornate, he argued, too slow, Too feminine, he actually said, which tells you something about both the era and about how penmanship had come to be entangled with ideas about gender. What America needed, Palmer declared in his 1894 Guide to Business Writing, was a plain and rapid style suited to the commercial pace of modern life. His method was revolutionary in one specific way. Rather than teaching students to write primarily with their fingers, which tires the hand quickly, Palmer taught them to write with the entire forearm muscle, resting the fleshy part of the arm on the desk and moving the whole limb in smooth, repetitive patterns. This, he argued, was a technique you could sustain for hours without fatigue, which was relevant because in an era before typewriters were common in every office, a professional clerk or accountant or bookkeeper might write continuously for most of their working day. The Palmer method was taught through obsessive repetition. Ovals, lines, more ovals, more lines. The same movements, over and over, until the arm knew what to do without asking the brain. Palmerized. The term actually entered the language. By the 1910s and 20s, millions of American schoolchildren had been Palmerized. Every desk in every public school had a hole in the upper right corner for the ink bottle, and the idea that a person's handwriting revealed their character, that the precision and care of your penmanship was an outward sign of the precision and care of your inner life, was genuinely held by teachers, employers, and parents as a reasonable measure of a person. I find something quietly remarkable in that idea. The notion that how you formed a letter on a page, the steadiness of your oval, the consistency of your spacing, said something real about who you were, not because it was true in any scientific sense, but because it reflected a culture in which the written word, formed by hand, was treated as a serious act, as something that deserved thought and effort and attention, as a form of self-presentation that carried genuine weight. We do not have that relationship with our typed words anymore. A text message takes 3 seconds. An email draft can be started a dozen times and abandoned. The backspace key makes everything provisional. And I suspect that this ease, this frictionlessness, has changed something about what we put into our written communication. When everything can be edited, nothing feels quite as committed. When everything is fast, nothing feels quite as meant. Let me stay with the Civil War letters for a moment, because I think they teach us something specific and important. Literacy rates among Civil War soldiers were high, above 80% for Confederate soldiers, and nearly 90% for Union soldiers, according to historians who have studied the records. And remember, these were not university graduates. These were farmers and craftsmen and shopkeepers, young men who had been educated in one-room schoolhouses where penmanship was taught as a core subject, and letter writing was practiced regularly as both a skill and a moral exercise. Many of them had been writing letters their entire adult lives, not to famous people, to their families, to the people down the road, to friends who had moved away. The letter was the medium through which they understood and maintained their relationships, and when the war began, and they were suddenly separated from everyone they loved by hundreds of miles of hostile territory, they wrote, obsessively, desperately, with extraordinary care. One Union soldier wrote 164 letters for himself and 37 more for illiterate comrades over the course of a single year. A chaplain's regiment was estimated to be producing more than 1 million letters per year across the Army of the Potomac. Mail call, the moment when the day's letters arrived in camp, became one of the most emotionally charged moments of military life. A soldier who received a letter went off alone, built a small fire for light if it was evening, and read it over and over. The ones who got nothing looked, according to one account, as if they had not a friend on earth. There is a letter I keep coming back to, written by a Georgia private named Andrew White to his family back home. In it he reports with evident pride that he has recently been weighed and came in at 197 pounds. He is excited. He believes that if he had not been stuck out in the rain on picket duty the previous night, he might have reached 200. It is, and I say this gently, not a profound letter. It is not Sullivan Ballew's masterpiece, but it is completely, heartbreakingly alive. You can hear this man's voice, his pride in his body, his wish to tell his family something good, his hope that the number, the solid, measurable, reassuring weight of him, will comfort them across the distance, and it does still 160 years later. That is what a handwritten letter does. It carries the person, not just their words, their hand, the specific pressure of their pen on the page, the slight lurch of emotion visible in a line that runs a little shaky, the crossed-out word that reveals the thought they changed their mind about, the smear of ink where they rested their wrist. These are things a text message cannot do, cannot even try to do. The Palmer method began declining in the 1950s. By the time the Common Core state standards arrived in 2010, cursive handwriting was no longer a required part of the national curriculum. Many states quietly stopped teaching it, and a generation of young people grew up who could print clearly enough but could not write in cursive at all. And then something quietly consequential happened that almost nobody noticed. Those young people discovered that they could not read it either. The letters in the attic became inaccessible, not because they had been lost, because the script in which they were written had become, within one generation, a foreign language. Historians who work with archival documents began noting that graduate students, people with advanced degrees in history, sometimes had to be taught to read 19th century cursive before they could engage with primary sources. The past, written down by hand over centuries, was becoming illegible to the people who were trained to study it. That feels, to me, like an almost unbearably precise metaphor for what we are talking about tonight. But here is the other side of this story. The science. Because researchers in the last decade or so have been discovering something genuinely surprising about what happens in the brain when a person writes by hand rather than typing. In 2023, a study published in the journal Frontiers in Psychology examined the brain activity of 36 university students using electrodes capable of recording electrical activity across 256 sensors. When those students wrote by hand, the researchers found widespread synchronized activity across a huge network of brain regions, areas responsible for movement, vision, sensory processing, and crucially, memory formation. When they typed the same words on a keyboard, these patterns were almost entirely absent. Professor Audrey van der Meer, who led the research at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, described the difference starkly. The brain connectivity patterns during handwriting were far more elaborate than during typing. That elaborate network, she noted, is known to be crucial for memory formation and for encoding new information. In other words, when you write something by hand, your brain works much harder to process and retain it. When you type, you might be recording the information, but you're not necessarily learning it, which explains something that many teachers have observed for years without being able to prove it. The students who hand-wrote their notes seemed to remember the material better, even though their notes were less complete, because the act of writing slowly, of being forced to choose what to record and how to phrase it, made them engage with the ideas rather than simply transcribing them. There is a detail from that same research that I cannot let go. Van der Meer mentioned in an interview about her findings that kindergarten teachers in Norway, a country moving rapidly toward fully digital schoolrooms, had been telling her that their incoming students barely knew how to hold a pencil anymore. 5-year-olds who had never coloured a picture, who had not spent hours as toddlers fitting puzzle pieces together or stacking blocks, small children who had skipped entirely the years of fine motor exploration that every previous generation had passed through in the normal course of childhood play. And she said, and I think about this often, that this was not just about penmanship, that the rich neural activity of handwriting was missing from these children's brains, not because they weren't smart or capable, but because the particular physical experience of tracing shapes in space with a hand had never happened. The connection between the body and the letter, the specific unhurried sensory experience of forming meaning by hand, had not yet been made, and she was worried about what that meant. I am worried about it too. Here is something I want you to think about. When was the last time you wrote a letter? A real letter. Not a birthday card where you signed your name under someone else's printed message. Not a sticky note on the refrigerator. A letter to someone you cared about. In your own words, in your own hand, that took some time and attention to compose. I asked myself this question a few years ago, and the answer was so far in the past that I genuinely could not remember, and I found that disturbing. Not because I had failed to meet some obligation, but because I realized that I had stopped doing something that, for most of human history, was how people said the things that mattered most. The letter was the medium of intimacy, of considered thought, of the kind of honesty that is easier to commit to when you have sat down with a pen and you know that what you write cannot be deleted. There is a revival happening quietly in this space too. Letter-writing circles have been appearing in cities across the United States and Europe. Fountain pen enthusiasts, a community that barely existed 20 years ago, now number in the millions worldwide. The market for quality notebooks and writing paper has been growing steadily for more than a decade, and the Common Core backlash brought cursive back into classrooms in California and in Indiana and Kentucky and South Carolina and Wisconsin and elsewhere. Not because politicians suddenly became nostalgic, but because enough teachers and parents and researchers had made the case that something neurologically important was being lost, that the body and the mind are not separate things, that the way we form language physically changes how we hold it mentally, that a letter written by hand is not a less efficient version of a typed email. It is a different thing entirely. One last thought before we move on. The Center for American War Letters at Chapman University houses more than 90,000 letters from soldiers and their families spanning 230 years of American conflicts, from the Revolutionary War through emails sent from Iraq and Afghanistan. When you read them in sequence, something becomes unmistakably clear. The quality of the writing, the richness, the specificity, the emotional courage, peaks in the handwritten ones, not the most educated writers, not the most famous, the ones who wrote by hand, who chose each word because paper was precious and time was short, and the person on the other end of that letter was the most important thing in their world. Handwriting does not just record thought. It shapes it, slows it, makes it more deliberate, more honest. And something about that combination, the slowness, the deliberateness, the irreversibility of ink on paper, may have been producing something in us as human beings that we're only now, in its absence, beginning to understand we needed. We have been moving through the world of things that people once knew how to do, in their kitchens, in their gardens, at their workbenches, with needle and thread and fire and jar and pen. But there is one skill we have not yet addressed, one that operates not in the domestic world but in the open world, the world outside the door, the skill of finding your way, not just reading a map, though that is part of it, but the deeper capacity to understand where you are in physical space without being told, to read a landscape, to know from the position of the sun or the stars or the shape of a hill on the horizon which way you're facing and how far you have to go. A capacity so ancient that it shaped the architecture of our brains, and a capacity that scientists have now shown is actively shrinking in people who outsource their navigation to a small glowing screen. That is a story worth staying awake for. Let me ask you something that might feel slightly embarrassing to answer honestly. If your phone died right now, battery gone, screen dark, and you were somewhere unfamiliar, could you find your way home? Not guessing, not hoping you recognize something eventually, but actually knowing from the position of the sun and the time of day which direction is west, from the slope of the land and the way the water runs, roughly where you are in relation to where you need to be. From memory, without assistance, the general layout of the streets you drove through to get here. Most people, if they are honest, would say no, and most people would probably follow that up with something like, "That's what phones are for," which is true, but I want to spend some time tonight with what that trade-off is actually costing us, because the science on this is more surprising and more troubling than almost anyone is talking about. The story I want to start with comes from London, specifically from the offices of a cognitive neuroscientist at University College London named Eleanor Maguire, and from the particular group of people she chose to study in the late 1990s, London taxi drivers. Now, if you have ever been to London, you know that the city is not like other cities. It was not planned on a grid. It was not organised into neat blocks. It grew organically over 2,000 years. Roman roads, medieval lanes, Victorian expansions, post-war rebuilding, until it became a dense, overlapping, occasionally maddening labyrinth of approximately 25,000 streets within a roughly 6-mile radius of central London. To become a licensed black cab driver in London, you have to demonstrate what is called the knowledge, which is exactly what it sounds like. You have to prove that you know every one of those streets, every major landmark, every hospital, theatre, hotel, railway station and park, every shortcut and back route and side lane, not just know of them, know them from memory. The training takes, on average, between 3 and 4 years. Candidates spend those years riding around the city on mopeds, clipboards strapped to the handlebars, memorizing routes and testing themselves on what they have learned. They are examined regularly and mercilessly. Most candidates fail their initial attempts multiple times. The ones who eventually pass carry in their heads one of the most detailed spatial maps of any living human being. Eleanor Maguire wanted to know what that kind of intensive spatial training did to the physical structure of the brain. So she recruited 16 licensed London taxi drivers, all right-handed men who'd been driving for at least a year and a half, and scanned their brains using structural magnetic resonance imaging. Then she compared those scans to a control group of people who did not drive taxis. What she found was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the year 2000, and it changed the way neuroscientists thought about the adult brain. The posterior hippocampus of the taxi drivers was significantly larger than in the controls, not slightly larger, measurably, meaningfully, structurally larger. And moreover, the longer a driver had been navigating London, the more years of active spatial knowledge acquisition, the greater the increase in volume. The brain had physically grown to accommodate the map. A follow-up study confirmed the finding even more precisely. Maguire compared taxi drivers to London bus drivers, people who also spent their days driving around the city, who were matched for stress, for general driving experience, for time behind the wheel. The only difference was that bus drivers followed fixed routes. They never had to figure out where they were or construct a mental map of their surroundings. They just followed the same roads day after day, and their hippocampi, did not show the same enlargement. It was not the driving that changed the brain. It was the navigation, the active, ongoing, cognitively demanding work of figuring out where you are and how to get where you need to go. That was what grew the hippocampus. And the hippocampus, it is worth noting, is not only the navigation center of the brain, it is also one of the primary regions involved in memory, in learning, and in the consolidation of new experiences. It is the part of the brain that declines earliest in Alzheimer's disease. The taxi drivers were, without knowing it, exercising one of the most cognitively vital organs in the human body simply by doing their jobs. Now hold that finding in your mind for a moment, and let me tell you about a different study. Published in Scientific Reports in 2020, researchers at McGill University in Montreal recruited 50 regular drivers and assessed their lifetime experience with global positioning system navigation, how long they had been using it, how heavily they relied on it. They also tested various aspects of spatial memory, how well the participants could form cognitive maps, how readily they noticed and encoded landmarks, how effectively they used spatial strategies to remember their position in an unfamiliar environment. The results were clear and dose-dependent. The more lifetime global positioning system experience a person had, the worse their spatial memory performed when they were asked to navigate without assistance. Not just slightly worse, significantly and measurably worse. And when a subset of participants was retested 3 years later, the finding held in the other direction too. The people who had used global positioning system more heavily in the intervening years showed a steeper decline in hippocampal-dependent spatial memory over time. The researchers were careful to rule out the obvious objection. Maybe people who already have poor spatial memory are simply more likely to rely on their global positioning system. They tested for this directly and found that those who used their navigation apps more extensively were not doing so because they felt they had a poor sense of direction. Their spatial memory declined because they outsourced the task, not the other way around. The hippocampus, that same structure that grew in the taxi drivers who exercised it daily, was shrinking in people who handed its function to a phone. When I sit with that finding, really sit with it, I find it almost impossible not to think about everything else we've discussed tonight. The bread that stopped being made by hand, the clothes that stopped being sewn and mended, the letters that stopped being written in careful, deliberate cursive, the jars that stopped being sealed at the end of summer. Each of these losses followed the same arc, a task that human beings had done actively with their bodies and their minds for a very long time was handed over to a technology that could do it faster and more reliably. And with each transfer, something in us went quiet. Not because the technology was bad, but because the practice of the skill had been doing something for us that the technology could not replicate. With navigation, we can measure exactly what that something was. It was a part of our brain, literally, measurably. We gave away a part of our brain, but before this becomes too heavy, because I genuinely do not want to end on something that just feels bleak, let me take you somewhere older, much, much older than GPS. Let me take you to the Pacific Ocean sometime around 3,000 years ago. A canoe is being loaded in what is now Taiwan, or the Philippines, or somewhere in island Southeast Asia. The people boarding it are not going on a day trip. They are leaving, permanently, heading out into the largest ocean on Earth with no instruments, no charts, no compass, no chronometer. Nothing but the accumulated navigational knowledge that has been passed from master navigator to apprentice for generations beyond count. And they are going to find islands, small islands, scattered across millions of square miles of open water, separated by distances that would challenge a modern vessel with every possible technology on board. The Polynesian people, and their predecessors the Austronesians, sailed and settled an area of the Pacific spanning from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south to Easter Island in the east, a triangle of ocean larger than the entire surface of the moon, and they did it without getting lost. How? The answer is one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of human cognition, and it operates on principles that are, in some ways, the exact opposite of how we think about navigation today. At the heart of Polynesian navigation is what they called the sidereal compass, not a physical object, a mental one. The navigator memorized, over years of training, often beginning in childhood, often encoded in songs and chants and stories specifically designed to make the information stick, the rising and setting points of dozens of specific stars on the horizon. Each star rose and set at a consistent bearing. A navigator who knew which stars were rising could orient themselves relative to any destination, anywhere in the Pacific at any time of night. Some of the most accomplished navigators knew over 150 stars and their bearings. The star compass divided the horizon into 32 houses, each separated by 11¼ degrees, named for the winds and the sky and the ocean, and on top of the stars the navigators read the ocean itself, the direction and shape of the swells, the behavior of specific bird species that flew predictable routes between islands, the patterns of clouds forming over land that was still invisible below the horizon, the feel of certain currents against the hull of the canoe. All of this was held simultaneously in the active mind of a person whose entire life had been devoted to learning to read the world. When the Polynesian voyager Tupaia sailed with Captain James Cook in 1769, Cook was astonished. Tupaia could name and locate over 100 islands across the Pacific, drawing from memory a chart of their positions relative to Tahiti. Cook, one of the greatest European navigators of his era, could not fully understand how Tupaia knew what he knew. He could see the results. He could not grasp the system, because the system was not in any instrument. It was in Tupaia's body, in his hands and his feet and his ability to feel the motion of the ocean, in his eyes and the way they had been trained, from childhood to read a sky, in a mind that has been specifically, deliberately, beautifully educated in the ancient science of finding yourself in the largest, emptiest, most featureless environment on Earth. Here is the thing about Polynesian navigation that I find most moving. By the mid-20th century it was nearly lost. Contact with the West, the adoption of motorized vessels with modern instruments, the disappearance of the guild structures within which navigational knowledge had been transmitted. All of this meant that by the 1960s and 1970s, the traditional art of open ocean wayfinding was practiced by only a handful of people in a few islands of Micronesia. In 1973, a group of Hawaiian scholars and sailors decided they needed to do something. They built a traditional double-hulled voyaging canoe. They found one of the last remaining traditional navigators, a man named Maupiai Lug from the island of Satawal in Micronesia, and they asked him to teach them what he knew. In 1976, the canoe Hokulea sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti, 2,500 miles across the open Pacific, guided by Mau using only traditional methods, no instruments, no compass, no charts, stars and swells and birds and the feel of the wind on the skin of his face. They arrived, and when they did, more than 10,000 people were waiting on the beach in Tahiti to greet them. Because the achievement was not just navigational, it was a declaration that the knowledge had survived, that it could be recovered, that something people had been told was gone forever could be reclaimed by those willing to make the investment of time and learning and devotion. Do you see the parallel? I see it everywhere tonight. In the bread that millions of people started baking in 2020 when the world stopped, in the community gardens multiplying in cities, in the repair cafes where people gather to fix things together, in the fountain pen communities and the letter-writing circles, in the young person who calls their grandmother to ask how to make stock from bones, in the forager who goes out before dawn to learn the edible plants growing in the park near their house, in every person who has ever turned off their navigation app for just one day and let themselves get a little lost in the city they have lived in for years, because they understood, instinctively, that getting a little lost is how you eventually know where you are. The skills we've been talking about tonight were not just practical tools. They were ways of being in the world, of being present to it, of engaging with it rather than delegating it. And the brain science tells us plainly that engagement was not incidental. It was building us. Every jar sealed, every letter written, every route remembered, every meal cooked from raw ingredients. All of it was exercising the remarkable, adaptable, use-it-or-lose-it organ that makes us who we are. There is still one skill we've not yet talked about. One that I have been saving, I admit, because in some ways it is the most haunting of the entire story. Not because it is gone, but because of what the science has recently revealed about how completely and how quickly we have forgotten it, and what its disappearance tells us about who we think we are now compared to who our great-grandparents were. It is the skill of first aid, of knowing what to do when someone in front of you is hurt, of not needing to wait for someone else to come, of being, in the most fundamental sense, capable. And the story of how ordinary people once carried this capability as naturally as they carried their house keys, and how we lost it in the space of 2 generations, is one I think you will find genuinely surprising. That is what comes next. Picture this. It is a Tuesday afternoon in 1887 in rural Ohio. A 10-year-old boy is out behind the barn with his older brother, doing something their mother has already told them twice not to do, and he falls badly. The arm comes down at the wrong angle on a fence rail, and there is that particular sound, the one that, once you have heard it, you never mistake for anything else. His mother comes running from the kitchen where she was preserving peaches. She assesses the injury. She sends the older boy to the neighbour's place for help. She knows exactly what to do in the next 5 minutes. And not because she was a nurse, not because she had any formal medical training, but because this was the knowledge you had. Just as surely as you knew how to start a fire or preserve a jar of beans or hem a pair of trousers, you knew the basics of treating a broken bone, a wound, a high fever, a snake bite, a burn. You knew the plants in your region that could do useful things. You knew how to stop bleeding. You knew how to recognize the difference between a condition that would resolve with rest and home remedies and one that required someone to ride to town for the doctor. This knowledge was not optional. It was not a specialty. It was simply what you needed to know to be a functional adult in a world where professional medical care was hours away, expensive, and, in the early centuries of American settlement, of genuinely questionable benefit. The history of American domestic medicine is, if I am being honest, a story that runs on 2 tracks simultaneously. On one track, there is the accumulated practical wisdom of women who functioned as the primary healthcare providers for their families and communities for generations, gathering medicinal herbs, treating fevers and wounds, assisting in childbirth, managing the full spectrum of ordinary illness and injury with what they had at hand. On the other track, there is an astonishing amount of what we would now recognize as misinformation. Patent medicines laced with opium, treatments that were actively dangerous, cures that killed as reliably as the diseases they claim to address. So I want to be careful here, because this is not a story that says the old ways were simply better. Many of them were not. Many were harmful. And the development of modern medicine, with its scientific rigor, its randomized trials, its sanitary practices, and its genuine efficacy, is one of the most extraordinary achievements in human history. But embedded within the domestic tradition of home medicine, coexisting with the quackery and the superstition and the bloodletting, was a real and valuable thread of practical competence that has largely disappeared from the everyday life of ordinary people. And that disappearance has a cost. In 1775, there were only 3,500 physicians in the entire American colonies, out of a population of roughly 2.5 million people. And of those 3,500, only a few hundred had any formal medical training at all. The rest had learned through apprenticeship, or through reading, or through their own years of trial, error, and careful observation. This is not as alarming as it sounds, because the alternative, in most households, was not a trained physician. It was the woman of the house and her reference books. One of the most widely owned volumes in colonial and early American households was a book called Every Man His Own Doctor, which first appeared in the 1730s. The title says everything about the philosophy behind it. Health was not something that happened to you while you waited for an expert to arrive. It was something you managed, actively, with knowledge, with plants from your own garden, with techniques passed down from your mother and her mother before her. Women were the village healers, not officially, not with credentials, but entirely practically. They knew the herbs that reduced fever, the poultice that drew infection from a wound, the tea that settled a colicky infant, the position that eased a difficult labour. Native Americans had developed, over thousands of years, what researchers have estimated at 25,000 medicinal uses for more than 2,700 plant species found growing across the continent. European settlers, finding themselves in a new land with unfamiliar ailments and an absence of familiar remedies, turned to these bodies of knowledge with a pragmatism that we might now call cultural borrowing, and which was, in practice, often the difference between surviving the first winter and not. The Civil War, which we've touched on throughout this story, transformed American medicine in ways that still shape how we care for the injured today. But in the beginning, it was a catastrophe. When the war began in 1861, both armies found themselves without enough surgeons, without enough supplies, without functioning hospital systems, and almost entirely without the sanitary knowledge that would have saved thousands of lives. Germ theory barely existed. Antiseptic practice was virtually unknown. Disease killed far more soldiers than combat. Approximately 2 men died from illness for everyone who fell in battle. Into this chaos walked a woman who had no formal medical training, no official military rank, and no particular reason to believe she would survive the battlefield she insisted on working. Clara Barton, born on December the 25th, 1821, in North Oxford, Massachusetts, a former schoolteacher and patent office clerk who, at the outbreak of war, saw wounded soldiers flooding the streets of Washington and immediately, without hesitation, went to help them. She gathered supplies from her own home. She solicited donations from the public. She drove wagons loaded with bandages and food toward the front lines, repeatedly, in battles that included Antietam, Fredericksburg, Petersburg, and Cold Harbor. A surgeon who encountered her at a field hospital one night, overwhelmed and desperate, later wrote that he genuinely believed in that moment she had been sent from somewhere beyond the ordinary world. His exact words, "I thought that night, if heaven ever sent out an angel, she must be one." After the war, Clara founded the American Red Cross in 1881, and in 1905, after resigning its presidency, she founded the National First Aid Association of America, a body specifically designed to teach ordinary people what she had understood from experience. That the most important medical care is often the care that happens in the first few minutes, before any professional arrives, by whoever happens to be there. Let me ask you a question that I genuinely want you to sit with. If someone collapsed right in front of you, right now, fell to the ground, unconscious, not breathing normally, what would you do? Beyond calling emergency services, what would you do with your hands? If you know the answer, you belong to a minority. A Cleveland Clinic survey found that while roughly 54% of Americans say they know how to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, only about 1 in 6 of those people actually know the correct technique. And about 70% of Americans, 7 in 10, report feeling helpless in a cardiac emergency because their training has either lapsed or never happened, which matters enormously because more than 350,000 out-of-hospital cardiac arrests occur in the United States every year. Approximately 90% of them are fatal. And the single most important variable in whether a person survives is whether someone nearby starts cardiopulmonary resuscitation immediately, not in 2 minutes when the emergency responders arrive, immediately, because survival chances decrease by 7 to 10% for every minute that passes without intervention, and because immediate bystander cardiopulmonary resuscitation can double or triple a person's chance of surviving. 73% of all out-of-hospital cardiac arrests happen in homes or residences, which means the life you're most likely to save, or fail to save, is not a stranger in a shopping mall. It is someone you love. I do not say any of this to make you feel guilty. That is genuinely not the point. The point is to trace the arc, to understand how we went from a world in which every rural household was expected to manage the full range of ordinary medical emergencies, broken bones, lacerations, burns, childbirth complications, high fevers in children, to a world in which the majority of adults do not know how to perform 3 minutes of chest compressions on a person whose heart has stopped. And the arc is the same one we've been tracing all night. A skill that was universal because it had to be, because the alternative was helplessness and frequently death, was slowly, generation by generation, handed off to professionals, as hospitals became accessible, as the doctor became someone you went to rather than someone who came to you, as ambulances and emergency rooms and medical schools and pharmaceutical companies created a world in which health became, increasingly, a product delivered by specialists rather than a capacity maintained by individuals, which is again not simply a story of loss. The hospitals are better than anything Clara Barton worked in. The emergency rooms are miraculous compared to a Civil War field hospital. The medicines work, and they have been tested, and we know why they work. All of that is genuine progress. But something smaller and more personal and more immediate went quiet along the way. The confidence to act, the trained instinct that says, I can help this person. I know what to do with my hands. I do not need to wait. There is a detail from the history of early American domestic medicine that I find genuinely moving. The household recipe books of the 18th and 19th centuries, the ones that families passed down through generations, often with handwritten additions in the margins from each new owner, almost never separated cooking recipes from medical remedies. They sat side by side. How to make a good pie crust on one page, how to treat a burn with a poultice of plantain leaves on the next, a recipe for apple butter, then a description of the symptoms of scarlet fever and what to do about them. These were not different categories of knowledge. They were the same knowledge, the knowledge of how to take care of the people in your household, how to keep them fed, how to keep them well, how to tend to them when they were not well. All of it written in the same hand, all of it considered equally important. I have thought about that a lot. The idea that the skill of caring for people, genuinely practically with your hands and your knowledge and your presence, was once considered a single, undivided thing. that you did not specialize in the cooking or the gardening or the first aid. You simply knew all of it because all of it was necessary, because all of it was yours. The revival is happening here too. Wilderness first aid courses, once the preserve of outdoor education specialists, have seen extraordinary growth in the last decade among ordinary adults who want to know what to do when there is no cell service and no ambulance coming. Community first aid programs have been expanding in cities and suburbs. The American Red Cross alone now trains approximately 8,000 people in first aid, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and automated external defibrillator use every single day. Every day. 8,000 people a day learning to do something that their great-grandparents knew by necessity and their grandparents were beginning to forget. And perhaps most significantly, a growing number of people are learning not because they were required to, not because their job demanded it, but because they decided that being helpless in the face of someone else's emergency was not acceptable, that the knowledge was worth having, that the capability was worth maintaining, that there is something profoundly wrong with a world in which a person can watch someone they love fall to the ground and do nothing but call for someone else to come and take care of it. We have moved through 10 of the skills tonight: cooking, sewing and mending, growing food from the ground, understanding fire, preserving and fermenting, fixing the things we own, writing by hand, finding our way without assistance, and now, tending to one another when something goes wrong. Each of these skills, when it was alive and practiced and passed from one generation to the next, was doing something beyond its obvious function. It was keeping people connected to the material world, to their own competence, to each other, and all of them are recoverable, every single one. We're close to the end of this journey now. There are 2 stops left. One of them brings together everything we've talked about in one of the most quietly astonishing historical stories I know. A story about what happens when a community loses all of these skills at once, and what it costs them. And the other is, I think, the most hopeful thing I've been saving all night. So stay with me a little longer. We are nearly there. Somewhere in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on a morning that probably looks about the same as it did 100 years ago, a 10-year-old boy is up before sunrise. He is feeding chickens, not because someone told him to do it for the first time this week, not because he is participating in an educational program, but because this is simply Tuesday. This is what Tuesday has looked like in his family and in this community for generations. The chickens know his footsteps. He knows which ones are laying and which ones are not, and why that matters, and what to do about it. He knows the signs that a hen is unwell. He knows how eggs travel from a living creature's body to his breakfast table, and it is not a mystery to him. It is just life. And when I think about how exotic that sentence sounds to most people in 2025, when I think about how profoundly unusual it is for a child to know those things, and how unremarkable that knowledge was just 3 generations ago, it opens up something in me that I find hard to name exactly. Something between grief and wonder. In 1900, approximately 40% of the American workforce lived and worked on farms. Those people, and the children being raised among them, understood, in a direct and physical way, the relationship between a living animal, the labor of caring for it, and the food that appeared on the table. They knew the difference between a cow that was in good health and one that was struggling. They knew how to read the behavior of a pig to understand when something was wrong. They knew the particular rhythms of the seasons as they related to what animals could be expected to do, when the cows would need more supplemental feed, when the chickens would go off lay, when the sheep were ready for shearing. This was not expertise confined to a small class of specialists. It was ordinary knowledge, held by ordinary people as naturally as they held the knowledge of how to read a weather forecast. And today, the proportion of the American workforce engaged in agriculture has fallen to less than 2%. In one century, that knowledge, accumulated over 10,000 years of human beings living alongside domesticated animals, became the exclusive province of less than 1 in 50 people. The rest of us have, generation by generation, been moving away from that knowledge, not because we chose to abandon it, but because the world reorganized itself around us so completely that the knowledge became unnecessary for daily life. And when knowledge is unnecessary for daily life long enough, it becomes invisible. And when it becomes invisible, it disappears. I want to be precise about what kind of knowledge I'm talking about here, because I think it is easy to confuse this with sentimentality about a simpler time. This is not about romanticizing the farm. Farming has always been brutally hard work. Animal husbandry involves birth and sickness and death, and the practical management of living things that do not always cooperate and cannot always be saved. Nobody who has ever spent a January night in a drafty barn trying to keep a newborn lamb alive in sub-zero temperatures would describe that as a charming pastoral experience. But embedded in all of that difficulty was something that I think we've lost track of in a way that is worth examining carefully. A relationship, a direct, unmediated, honest relationship between a person and the thing they were eating. Not a package, not a brand, not a product designed in a laboratory and manufactured in a facility that no member of the public has ever set foot in. A relationship. Consider what that relationship actually required. If you kept chickens, you knew what chickens ate. You knew what conditions made them thrive. You knew what stress looked like in a bird and what comfort looked like. And when you cooked one, when that particular animal became your dinner, you understood in your body and your memory exactly what it had taken to bring that moment about. The feed, the water, the cold mornings, the year of small daily attentions. You could not pretend the meat was an abstraction. It was not a photograph on a menu. It was not a product in a styrofoam tray under plastic wrap. It was a thing you had known, and I believe, though I cannot prove this scientifically, that the knowledge of what food costs in labour and care and time changes how you feel about waste. It changes your relationship with what is on your plate. It gives the meal a weight, a significance, that is almost impossible to manufacture through any other means. The food illiteracy of the modern world is real, and it is measured. A survey conducted by the United States dairy industry a few years ago found that 7% of American adults believed chocolate milk came from brown cows. That number became a viral story, and there were plenty of jokes. But the more revealing figure in the same survey was not the 7%, it was the 48%. 48% of respondents were not sure where chocolate milk came from. Not sure. And a study published in the Journal of Agricultural Education found that 72% of children living in urban California could not confirm that cheese was made from cow's milk. A further study from Michigan State University found that 48% of American adults rarely or never sought out any information about where their food came from or how it was produced. Nearly half of the adult population of one of the world's wealthiest and most well-fed nations had essentially no curiosity about the origins of the thing they consumed 3 times a day. Now, I do not say this to be superior about it. I grew up in a suburb. My understanding of where food came from, for most of my childhood, extended to the observation that it appeared at the grocery store in exchange for money. Beyond that, I had the same comfortable fog that most of my generation shared, the fog of not needing to know. The reason this matters, beyond the obvious nutritional and environmental implications, is something more fundamental. The National Dairy Council spokeswoman who commented on the survey said something that I think deserves to be quoted directly. She said, "We know people are confused about where their food comes from. A majority of us are now generations removed from the farm. Generations removed, not years, generations. which means this is not a knowledge gap that any individual failed to fill. It is a cultural inheritance that was simply not passed down. The child of a farmer knew how food grew because she watched it grow. The child of that child might have visited a farm occasionally. The child of that child had no farm to visit. The child of that child grew up in a world where the entire production of food was invisible, handled invisibly by a small fraction of the population using industrial methods in places the public never sees. And each step in that chain was entirely reasonable, taken on its own. It was only the accumulated distance, the generations of distance, that produced a population that is, in many practical ways, entirely disconnected from the biological origins of its own sustenance. Here is the historical detail that I think brings this into the sharpest possible focus. In the early 1900s, farms in the United States were almost uniformly what agricultural historians call diversified. That word means what it sounds like. A typical farm in 1905 grew several crops, perhaps corn, wheat, and vegetables, and also kept several species of animals: chickens, pigs, a few dairy cows, perhaps some sheep. The farm was designed to be a system. The animals ate the waste from the crops. The manure from the animals fertilized the soil for the next season's crops. The chickens controlled insects. The pigs converted scraps into protein. Everything fed into everything else, in a cycle that required genuine skill to manage, to understand when the rotation was off, when the soil needed rest, when the animals were under nutritional stress that would affect the quality of what they produced. A farmer who knew his animals well was not simply a person who had gotten used to being around livestock. He was a practitioner of an integrated science, a reader of biological systems that express themselves in the behavior and health of living things. And a farmer's wife, managing the household economy, held her own body of knowledge: how to select a healthy bird for the table, how to judge the quality of an egg from a hen who was not thriving, how to stretch the meat further through preservation and cooking techniques that maximized what the animal had to give. This was not sentimentality. It was competence. This shift away from diversified farming happened rapidly, and for reasons that were, on their face, economically rational. After the Second World War, agricultural economists and government policy pushed farmers toward specialization. Grow one thing, grow it efficiently, sell it in volume. Stop keeping a few pigs and chickens on the side. Focus on corn, or soybeans, or dairy cattle. And the farms that embraced specialization did, in fact, produce more. A farmer in 1940 could supply food for approximately 19 people. By 1980, one farmer could feed 76. The efficiency was real, the productivity was extraordinary. But what disappeared in that transition, from the diversified mixed farm to the specialized industrial operation, was the connection between the people working the land and the full range of what the land produced. A grain farmer does not need to know what a healthy cow looks like. A poultry operation does not require its operators to understand the nutrient cycles of a mixed farm. The knowledge that once integrated all of these things, the whole systems thinking of the diversified farmer, became, like so many other skills we've discussed tonight, the province of specialists. And as it moved away from the center of ordinary life, it moved out of the stories families told and out of the knowledge parents passed to children. And 3 generations later, here we are. This is where I want to spend a moment on the Amish, because the Amish represent something unusual and worth pausing over, not as a religious or cultural endorsement, but as a data point. The Amish communities of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and elsewhere have maintained more or less continuously the kind of diversified farming and animal husbandry practices that most of rural America abandoned in the mid-20th century. and they have done so not by freezing in time, but by making a deliberate series of choices about which innovations to adopt and which to decline. The result is a community in which the connection between labour, land and food has remained intact through multiple generations. Children in Amish communities grow up knowing what chickens eat, how cows behave when they're close to calving, how the soil looks when it's healthy, and how the cycle of the farm year shapes the rhythms of ordinary life. They know these things not because they were taught them in a classroom, but because the knowledge is embedded in the daily structure of their world. And what is striking, and I find this genuinely interesting from a social science perspective, is the relationship those communities have with food waste, with material consumption, and with what they call stewardship. When you understand what it takes to produce food, you do not throw it away carelessly. When you know the animal, you do not treat its products as infinite or as divorced from consequence. There is something in that directness of knowledge that shapes behavior in ways that no amount of consumer education seems able to replicate. I want to ask you something. Do you know what a healthy chicken looks like? Not in a vague, general way. Specifically, the brightness of the eye, the condition of the comb, the way a bird that is thriving carries itself compared to one that is under stress. Most people, including me, would say no, and 200 years ago that answer would have been as baffling to hear as it would be today to tell someone you do not know how to use a phone. It was basic. It was assumed. It was the knowledge that separated someone who could sustain a household from someone who could not. I find it fascinating that we live in a moment when more information is available to more people than at any time in human history, and yet the specific, embodied, relational knowledge of how food actually comes to exist has never been more widely absent. We know more facts about more things than any generation before us, and we know less collectively about the single most fundamental act of keeping ourselves alive. The good news, and there is genuine good news here buried under everything else, is that the revival of this knowledge is already underway. Small-scale farming has been growing, quietly and steadily for the past 2 decades. The number of farms in the United States under 50 acres has actually been increasing. Urban chicken keeping, the keeping of a small backyard flock of laying hens in cities and suburbs, has become legal in many jurisdictions that had previously banned it in response to growing public demand. Community-supported agriculture programs, through which ordinary households commit to buying directly from a specific local farm through the season, now connect millions of families across the country to the people who grow their food and the land those people work. And perhaps most tellingly, the question of where food comes from and how it was produced and what it costs in terms of land and labour and animal welfare has become one of the most widely discussed topics in contemporary culture. That conversation is not uniform and it is not simple. But the fact that it is happening, the fact that people are asking the questions, is itself a kind of turning back. A turning back toward the knowledge that was not lost exactly, just set aside. Waiting, the way all good knowledge waits for the people who are ready to claim it again. We've been on a long journey tonight, 10 skills now behind us, and through every one of them, I've been building towards something, a story, a specific, true, documented story about what happens when all of these skills, the cooking, the growing, the repairing, the navigating, the preserving, the tending to one another, disappear from a community at the same time. And what happens when they come back? It is the most hopeful story I know, and the strangest, and it is set in a place you might not expect. So stay with me, because this is where everything we've talked about tonight comes together, and I promise it is worth it. There is an art form in Japan that is somewhere between 500 and 600 years old. It is called kintsugi, And I have been saving it for this moment because I think it might be the most beautiful metaphor for everything we have talked about tonight. Here is how it works. When a ceramic bowl or cup or plate breaks in most cultures, you have two options. You throw it away, or you repair it as invisibly as possible, using glue that dries clear, touching up the crack with paint that matches the glaze, trying to restore the object to a state that pretends the break never happened. The goal is concealment. The goal is to make the damage disappear. Kintsugi does exactly the opposite. When a piece of pottery breaks, the kintsugi practitioner repairs it with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. Not hidden. Gold. The crack is not disguised. The crack is highlighted, traced in precious metal, made luminous, made visible. The philosophy behind it, rooted in the Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi, the appreciation of imperfection and impermanence, is this. The break is not a failure. The break is part of the object's history. It is a chapter in the story the object has been living, and a thing that has been broken and repaired with care and skill and intention is not a diminished version of what it was. It is something more, something that carries its own journey in its surface, something that would not exist in its particular, irreplaceable form without having passed through that damage. I want to hold that image in front of everything we've talked about tonight, because I think it applies with an almost uncanny precision to the skills we've been tracing. The cooking, the sewing, the gardens, the fermentation, the repair, the handwriting, the navigation, the first aid, the knowledge of animals and seasons and where food comes from. All of these things were broken, in a sense, over the course of the 20th century. Not destroyed, not erased, but cracked, passed over, left in drawers and attics and the backs of closets, like the darning mushroom and the mason jar and the compass, waiting. And what I see happening right now, in all the places we've been visiting tonight, looks to me very much like kintsugi. People finding those cracks, filling them back in, not trying to pretend they were never broken, but tracing them in gold, making them visible, making them, in their particular imperfect hard-won recovery, more beautiful than they were before. Let me tell you about the numbers, because this is not just a feeling. This is something that is measurable and documented and growing. A 2023 survey by the Homesteaders of America organization found that nearly half of its 4,000 respondents were under the age of 39. Half. Millennials and Generation Z, the two generations most often described as disconnected from practical skills, distracted by screens, alienated from the physical world. They are now the primary growth demographic of the homesteading movement. And nearly half of those respondents were new to homesteading. They had started in the previous 3 to 6 years. They were not following a tradition passed down through their families. They were building it from scratch, because they decided they wanted it, because they looked at the world around them, at the fragility of the supply chains they had been told to depend on, at the disconnection they felt from the things they consumed, at the sense that something important was missing from how they were living, and they turned back toward the workbench, toward the kitchen, toward the garden, toward the skill. Repair cafes, those community gathering spaces where people bring their broken things and share tools and knowledge, and an afternoon of patient collective fixing, started with a single event in Amsterdam in 2009, founded by a woman named Martine Postma. By 2021, there were more than 2,000 of them in 37 countries, 2,000 places where people gather not to buy things, not to consume, but to fix things together, and to pass on, informally and generously, the knowledge of how. In Japan, the art of kintsugi itself has seen a remarkable revival among younger practitioners, not as a historical curiosity, as a living practice, as something they choose. In 2020, when a basketball court in South Los Angeles was fractured and needed repair, an artist named Victor Solomon was commissioned to fix it. He repaired the court using kintsugi, gold-dusted resin, tracing every crack, and called it simply Kintsugi Court, a broken surface, repaired with care in a neighborhood that had known plenty of breaks of its own, made more beautiful in its imperfect recovery than a plain, unbroken surface could ever have been. Here is what I believe is actually happening. Underneath all the data, the repair cafe numbers, the homesteading surveys, the sourdough books selling out, the fountain pens finding new devotees, the first aid courses filling up, the community gardens multiplying in city parks. Underneath all of it is something that I think is simpler and more human than any of the individual trends it manifests as. People are trying to recover a relationship with the world, not a romantic relationship, not a nostalgic one, a functional one. The relationship in which you understand through direct experience how things work, where your food comes from and what it costs, what your house is made of and how it holds together, how a living thing behaves when it is thriving and how it behaves when it is not, how language looks when a human hand puts it on a page, how to find yourself in the world without being told where you are, how to help someone who is hurt right now before help arrives. All of these skills in their very different domains were performing the same underlying function. They were keeping people connected to matter, to consequence, to the honest, irreplaceable feeling of doing something that is genuinely useful, of being the kind of person who can be relied upon. There is a passage from the writer and farmer Wendell Berry that I have been turning over in my mind for years. He wrote, "It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work, and when we no longer know which way to go, we have begun our real journey." I think about those words when I think about what is happening with the skills we've been discussing tonight. The people who are learning to bake their own bread and repair their own clothes and grow their own food and write letters by hand and find their way without being told. They are not doing these things because they have run out of options. They are doing them because they have recognized something, that the knowing matters, that the doing matters, that being genuinely capable, in your hands, in your body, in the physical world, is not a lesser version of success. It might be the foundation of it. Let me ask you one final question tonight, and I want you to think about this one seriously because I think it might be the most important question this whole journey has been building toward. What is one skill, just one, that you wish you had learned? Not for any practical reason necessarily, not because your survival depends on it, but because some part of you, some quiet, persistent, ancient part of you, knows that knowing it would make you more fully yourself. Maybe it is bread, maybe it is mending, maybe it is growing something from a seed, maybe it is learning to navigate a city you have lived in for years without looking at your phone. Maybe it is something you watched a grandparent do when you were young and never asked them to teach you, and now it is too late to ask them, and you feel that gap as a specific named kind of loss, whatever it is. That is the crack the gold goes into. That is where the kintsugi starts. We have travelled a long way tonight, through kitchens and gardens and garages and workshops, through the hands of soldiers who wrote letters home, and women who preserved the harvest, and farmers who knew their animals by name, through the secret meeting room in Geneva where light bulbs were made deliberately worse, and the tire tracks of a train full of turkeys going in circles through the Midwest in 1953, and a rooftop in Manhattan where wartime neighbours grew tomatoes in whatever soil they could carry up 6 flights of stairs. Through the brain of a London taxi driver growing larger with each year of navigation, and the brain of a GPS user quietly losing the same capacity it had not been asked to use. Through the fire station in Livermore, California, where a light bulb that was made with genuine care and the intention that it should last has been glowing continuously since 1901. More than 120 years of steady, unbroken light. Not because technology intervened, because someone once made something worth keeping. I think about that bulb sometimes when I feel overwhelmed by how much has been lost, and then I remember what has not been lost. The seed, the recipe, the technique, the method. All of it is still here. All of it exists in books and memories and the hands of people old enough to remember, and in the fresh curiosity of people young enough to be learning it for the first time. None of the skills we have discussed tonight are gone. They are just waiting, the way seeds wait, patient and alive for the person who decides to plant them. You are that person if you choose to be. Thank you. I mean that with everything I have. Thank you for spending this night with me, for staying with every story, every number, every quiet little moment of recognition when something I described reminded you of someone you knew or something you once held in your hands and understood. For those of you who've been listening with the lights already dim, I hope tonight was the kind of rest that teaches you something, the kind that lets you wake up with a small, specific new question forming in the back of your mind. Something you want to learn, something you want to do differently, something you want to ask the person down the street who still keeps a garden, or the grandmother who still keeps a sewing kit, or the grandfather whose garage you've always been a little afraid of stepping into. Step into it. Ask the question. There is still time. There is almost always still time. If this story stayed with you tonight, if something in it moved or surprised or lingered, please take a moment to share it with someone you think might need to hear it. Not because it will go viral, but because the stories that matter most are always the ones we pass to the people right next to us, like seeds, like recipes, like the slow, careful knowledge of how things work. And if you have thoughts, skills you're learning, things you remember from your own grandparents' hands, moments of recognition that you want to put into words, leave them in the comments. I read everyone. I always do. Because this story, like all the skills in it, is only alive when we keep it moving between us. The next story is already waiting. It is about something stranger than anything we discussed tonight. Something that will, I promise, make you look at the ordinary objects in your daily life in a way you have never quite looked at them before. Stay close, get some rest, and I will see you again soon. Good night.